Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which seeks to bring you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. In this episode, Richard and I resume with our discussion of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire for the Reading Revolution series. This is part 2. By the way, for those of you who are listening, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spreaker, or Soundcloud, and also to follow us on Twitter at LeftPOC, Facebook at LeftPOC, or I should say Patreon by going to patreon.com/LeftPOC. On the Patreon page, you'll find all the free books and information that go along with the podcast, as well as find out ways to donate. So be sure to check that out. And on with the show. So Richard and I are back. This is another episode of Reading Revolution, and we're going on to part 2 of our discussion of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And where we left off in the first part of our discussion was at the sort of beginning of the actual intro to the book that was written by Freire, because as we discussed in part 1, there are like multiple prefaces and intros to this book that actually also contain really interesting and fascinating information that we did not want to skip over. But in this case, we had a little bit to finish on the preface or the introduction from Freire himself, and then we can start going into chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I think specifically where we left off, you and I were talking about, or at least I was asking a question about what does Freire mean when he talks about love throughout this work. He sort of hints at it in the preface, but then also the meaning of this phrase or this term that comes up throughout the book, and especially in his preface, which is the word in Portuguese, conscientização, which means like the process of consciousness making. So I just wanted to start with a brief discussion of that, and then you and I can get into chapter 1. Mm-hmm. So for those of you specifically who are reading along in this edition of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, if you go to page 35, at the very bottom, the translator was nice enough to provide an actual definition, because if you look at the word conscientização, it literally means, if you were to translate it literally, it means conscientization, which is not an English word, but it's like the creation or the making of consciousness. And so the translator says, quote, "The term conscientização refers to the learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality." So even that is sort of confusing in some ways. I mean, what do you think he means by that, Richard? If you looked at that definition, because the definition is kind of also a little bit bulky, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of reading Aristotle, and just that it's kind of a bulky statement at the front end that you're going to have to read the book to understand completely. Like, it just gives you an idea of like, oh, okay, so learning to perceive the social, political, and economic contradictions. Well, wait, what does he mean contradictions? And it's like, okay, I'm going to need to read more to understand this, because he's introducing or using terms in ways that aren't familiar already for, I think, most of us. So that's my first impression. And then I guess that when it's in taking action against the oppressive elements of reality, I see echoes of praxis, and that part of this is going to be it's going to be an active thing. It's not going to be a passive observational thing. So it's not just simply looking on the world, but it's also interacting with that world.
Right. And he does this thing too, where like throughout this introduction, he doesn't just tell us stuff. And I think this is good for us to think about when we start talking about chapter 2, about his way of educating, right? What Freire considers a more productive way to educate others. But like, he doesn't just tell us stuff. He's not like, this is what this means, and there you have it. This is the definition we're working with. He sort of like lets the definitions unfold, which I kind of appreciate, because it really does, as you said, it like makes you get more deep into the book and like read along and try to understand and unpack things bit by bit, as opposed to just like expecting a definition to see and memorize and then keep going, you know? So like, if you look at the top of 36, he starts to kind of break apart the meaning of the term. He says, for example, top of 36, on the contrary, it's by making possible for people to enter the historical process as responsible subjects. Conscientiousness enrolls them in search of self-affirmation and thus avoids fanaticism. So like, and then he says further, the awakening of critical consciousness leads the way to the expression of social discontents, precisely because these discontents are real components of an oppressive situation. So basically, the way I read that is like, if you're in a situation where you're being oppressed and like you're what you're living on a daily basis, the process of becoming more conscious is not just a matter of like someone coming down and telling you what to do, but you're being able to see and finally assess what's happening. Like, as you said, a search for self-affirmation, right? And I think if you do that, and he talks about this a bit in chapter 1 too, but if you do that, it keeps you from just following people, you know, and this is what he means when he says like, you can avoid fanaticism. So it's not just a matter of like following a leader who will help free you from your oppression, but instead you becoming conscious and then freeing yourself, right? Because ultimately this liberatory process that he describes is one that involves the community of oppressed people coming to terms with what's happening to them, assessing it, and then working toward their own liberation, not something that's top down, you know?
Yes, it's very grassroots and, interactive. And that's, I think, a theme that we see repeated throughout the book, and definitely something that Freire wants all of us to pull away from the book, I gather, is that it's an engagement with this process, and not in the top down, as he calls it, the banking model, and it's been referred to as, like the pitcher model, where you're filling an empty pitcher. That he rejects outright that will work. I mean, and he says it several times, essentially in a few different ways, that you can't achieve liberation that way. That you get something else. But go ahead.
I mean, the other thing too that like I personally, I mean, there's the problem with this book is that I just highlighted the whole thing, right? Like it's one of those books where, you know, when you're little and you're like first starting school and you get your highlight, people don't highlight anything anymore these days, right? Like everything's with a computer. But I remember when I was little, and you know, highlighters were like this big thing, and markers and whatever, and you would use your markers to take your notes and to highlight important parts of the text. And when learning how to properly do these things and how to properly take notes, you know, the teacher was always like, you don't need to write down what I say verbatim. You don't need to highlight the whole book. You know, you have to highlight the most important parts. And I was always like, but what if the whole book is important? You know, like everything he says in this particular book, it's one of those cases where like every line is full of so much information and like it makes you think so deeply about things. And I think that's a testament to how great the book is, to be honest, and how important the theory that he lays out in it is. So like on this same page, I think it's like page 37 or so, he says that we have to be careful not to confuse freedom with the maintenance of the status quo. And that like conscientisation is something that threatens the status quo, right? That the point of it is to not have us repeating the same mistakes. It's supposed to break us free from this process, right? And I think that's something that we also have to really come to terms with, because sometimes as people in general, it doesn't matter what country you're from, but I think we have a tendency to kind of get comfortable with the status quo, even if it's oppressing us. And sometimes overthrowing that it creates a great sense of discomfort inside of us, because we don't feel like we have any reassurances that things are going to get better. And he talks about this too, like this sort of moment where you lack the confidence and the self-confidence that there's freedom, like that the oppressed have a moment where we have trouble grappling with what freedom is. And because we've been confused for so long, we've been told over and over that freedom looks this way, when in actuality, it's not a repeat of the status quo, and it's not an adjustment or a reform of the status quo, but it's an overthrowing, it's a threatening, it's an undoing of the status quo, and that we need conscientious assent to get to that point, but that's one of the things that I like, and he says over and over in many ways, that I kept finding myself highlighting because it's true. And I think we have a tendency to just kind of, I don't know, we don't, sometimes I don't think we even realize that we're just still reliant upon status quo methods to resolve much, much bigger problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And how reliant we are on the comforts provided by certain status quo arrangements, and how, what that challenge means if we do challenge the underlying assumptions necessary to those for those conditions, the necessity we feel for a cell phone, and then the realities of the conditions that it takes to produce a cell phone. If we actually challenge those and actually look at them, are we going to always determine that we're going to need it, or do we want to just not really think about it so that we don't have to come to that conclusion? That we might come to the conclusion that we don't need it. It's not helping us. It's a negative. It's a net negative, and we'd be better off without it. It's like, well, that's scary. It is just the feeling of not knowing where your phone is for a moment can raise your anxiety level and blood pressure and heart rate. And it's like the idea that you may have to find an existence without it. That's terrifying. It's like, but it may be a better existence is the hopeful part of that. And but just leaving those options and investigating and analyzing the situation and looking at those contradictions is an unsettling feeling for most. And I've experienced it multiple times as I've started to engage with this material and try to see how it applies to my life.
Yeah, for sure. There's something that I think I want to table and not discuss for now that's in the intro, but perhaps we can do in part 3 or when we do the conclusion for our discussion of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But for those who are reading along, I think it's page 38. Basically all of page 38, I was sort of left with a big question mark because Freire talks about our understanding of future and past and time. And the ways that the left and the right have tendencies to fall into these sort of sectarian practices. And I think it's something that we should perhaps revisit, not now because I do want to get to chapter 1 and 2, but I just want to table that for later because I highlighted it and was a bit confused by his position, but I also wonder if sort of his historical circumstances are what put him in a position to say what he says about both the left and the right. But I do want to keep going. And I just wanted to say that on the next page, he starts talking about and outlining what he means by Pedagogy of the Oppressed as he goes into chapter 1. And also he talks about the need for us to not just, again, sort of not to reinvent the wheel or to reaffirm status quo, but the need for us to be radical. If we're actually planning on liberating ourselves in any way, we have to go beyond just reform. And we have to engage in radical practices that will make us uncomfortable and that will, at the same time, they do have to rely on not just making people uncomfortable. That's not the basis of the process of radicalization, but that just to be prepared for that discomfort and also to be prepared to renounce it and to go beyond that discomfort and find a real sense of dialogue with other people and learn new ways of engaging with those that we're trying to collaborate with toward change. So I know that sounded like word salad, but that's kind of how this book reads at some points, right? But I think I think it's also good for us to maybe talk about that as well, the way it was written, because one of the things that he talks about throughout is the need for us to be able to just, everyone can pick this up and read it, but sometimes it's going to take some time. I don't think for me, it's never been a book that I'm just oh, I can read this on the train or whatever and not I think it's a book that for a lot of us has to be read slowly, where you kind of you look at each sentence and you take it apart and you say what does he mean by this? And that's a practice that I don't know, maybe it's just me. I don't know, Richard, you can feel free to jump in on this, but when you were reading it, did you ever find yourself also wondering, like, am
Uh,
I misreading something, or should I, like,
I
am I
mean,
stupid? Like, but I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on just the way it was written too, the style of the book?
yeah, I mean, I definitely felt some of that. I started to engage with it, and at first, when I just first did my first look at it, when I was like, okay, this, I got the recommendation, and I was like, okay, this looks like a good book, and I was just flipping through and reading some things. I was like, oh wow, okay, here's some words and terms and phrases in ways that doesn't make sense to me, and I'm looking at the words around it. You're trying to use my context clues, and I'm not getting there. I'm looking at the dictionary definition, and it doesn't seem to match up with the usage, and this doesn't seem like a translation issue. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be deep. And then I start
Mm-hmm.
reading it, and then as I've mentioned before on previous uh, episodes, that I use the natural reader thing online so that I can listen to the app or listen to the text while I usually read along.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely found myself rewinding and going back and like, wait a minute, what? And so like, in one of the things that when I engage with material, and something I feel about not just theory myself, but with art as well, is that, the creator has an intention, and then they put that intention, and sometimes they share that with the audience, and sometimes they don't directly, but
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't limit the creation from inspiring other avenues of thought. And so uh I don't claim, like, I can be inspired by a thought, and it may or may not be what was intended or what was but I try to make sure that when I present it to somebody else, I mention this is what I interpreted out of it, not necessarily this is what they were saying or this is what they meant. And I found that this was going to be a lot of that uh, I'm going to do my best to give the people both, direct quotes about what he's saying specifically, but then also how I was able to interpret that, or how it applied to me. And some of the things that you were just mentioning, some of the quotes that stuck out to me was that the radical committed to human liberation on page 39, about halfway down,
Mm-hmm.
does not become the prisoner of a circle of certainty, within which reality is also imprisoned. And uh, when you get through the text, and you understand what he's saying when he's talking about reality and liberation, I think that makes more sense. But in before you've read it, it only kind of, I think, clues you into it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that was part of kind of what you were talking about there. And then the other part of that was this individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. And so, like you mentioned, that to be that, could making people uncomfortable isn't the point, but in order to be engaged in this process, you can't, like, live in a perpetual fear of, knowing more might
Mm-hmm.
ruin. Like, I experience this constantly. For me, the first one that happened that, like, really sticks out in my mind is on Twitter. Mark Lamont Hill mentioned something about professional wrestling, like WWF, WWE, and basically pointed out how racist the characters were early, and how racist some of the actual people in the sport were, and all this. And it's like, oh, you just ruined my childhood. It's like, I don't want to be on Twitter anymore if this is what's going to happen. If everything that I've loved and I've grown up thinking was a happy thing was actually just oppressing me, and, perpetuating all these evil stereotypes and all this bad things. It's like, I don't want that. I'd rather just think that those were happy things. It's like, well, no, if we're going to engage in this process, we can't be afraid of that. We have to, confront it and go boldly.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two stuck out as far as, and kind of encapsulated, and that's how I related to some of what you were just talking about.
No, absolutely. And that part about, like, the quote that you read about the radical, I also highlighted that because I think it's one that, and as you said, he gets into this later, but it helps us break down the sense of fatalism, right? Because I think, this is something I fall prey to all
Mm-hmm.
the time. And even for anyone who's ever listened to our Reading Revolution discussions, I'm the one, like I said in the year in review, I'm the one where, like, there's no solution. Like, this is it. And it is an easy trap to fall into because, and I admit, like, I'm sitting here racking my brain, like, what can little old Wendy and Richard do to fix XYZ humongous problem, right? And I think that what he's saying here is like, if you're truly radical, you're not worried about that, right? Like the reality, you're not seeing yourself as trapped by the reality. You have to think beyond it. And like, I really appreciate that reminder, because I do think that sometimes, and this is not just me, this is like everyone on the left, because we're so preoccupied with the problems of the world, as we should be. But I think sometimes that constant onslaught of this very depressing and like negative news can also sometimes trap us into this feeling that all of a sudden, oh, what are we going to be able to do about it though, right? Like, what can we do to change it if we don't possess the means, the material means, the money, the weapons, whatever, to engage in like something that interrupts these much more powerful things. And so I think for him, he's saying that it's not just about this material aspect of it, but it's also a process that has to take place inside the human being, inside of all of us. We have to have first a liberation of our minds before we can start liberating ourselves as a society, you know? And I think this is a key step that sometimes we forget is important. And I appreciate him introducing that. It seems minor, you know, but it's like a huge thing, actually. If we're all living within these minds that are also trapped, that means that there's an indefinite limit. Like there's always going to be a wall on what we can actually do. And so that's a good reminder for all of us that like, if we are truly committed to radicalism, we can't just see a wall first. We have to get beyond and break beyond the wall. And that requires a lot of requires a lot of introspection and rethinking what we've learned and rethinking the status quo. So going into chapter 1, one of the things that he mainly focuses on in chapter 1 is this idea of humanization. And I think this is important for us to talk about really briefly, because in some of the intros, they mentioned that, you know, he was preoccupied with questions of class and race and gender and all of that. But one of the things that he saw as unifying for the oppressed was that there was a process of dehumanization where we were made unhuman, basically. And that the process of someone who's engaging in radical change, one of the first steps is to then recognize that we have to rehumanize ourselves. Ultimately, we have to create a sense of humanization. And that means really kind of valuing the person as not just an object, but as a member of a society and a contributing member of that society, especially one that we want to see as a free society, right? So it's not just you're not just somebody who's working, you're not just someone who's sitting in a classroom, but you're also an active and engaged member of whatever you plan to produce out of that space. So this is around 43 and 44, where he talks about so we'll start maybe with dehumanization and explain what that means and how he defines it. But he says on 44, dehumanization, which marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also in a different way, those who have stolen it. It is a distortion of the vocation of becoming fully human. And he keeps going on. He says, this struggle is possible only because dehumanization through a concrete historical fact is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. So basically, he's like, people who consider themselves oppressed and who are oppressed within a system are not the only ones who are oppressed. Ultimately, even those who are engaging in oppressing others are trapped by their own system of oppressive behavior. You know what I mean? And it's something I've heard as well about, like, there have been some arguments, even Frederick Douglass makes an argument about this with regard to the ways that slavery not only enslaved the slave, but also put the slave master in a system in which it was like a perpetual, in order to create who he was, he had to engage in this oppressive practice that ultimately kind of, in some ways, oppresses, I don't want to say oppresses because I don't think slave masters were oppressed, but I would say limits the space in which they too operate, right? Because it defines their role as someone who engenders this violence and who dehumanizes, but also is dehumanized in that mutual process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and it's hard for me to kind of respond without encapsulating the whole text that I've read, but I think it relies a lot on the concept of love, as we mentioned earlier, and of and he mentions it later on. I don't know exactly where the quote is at the moment, but I think we'll come across it later as we dissect the chapter specifically.
Yeah.
Is that the that in order to be an oppressor, it strips your ability to love basically anyone but yourself, and in that process, like that, when in order to rob somebody of their humanity, you have to rob everyone of a certain bit of humanity. It's kind of a different take on an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, in that if you're when you take somebody's humanity, you kill a little part of your own. It's kind of unavoidable, and the more you participate in this oppressive system, the more it prevents you from not applying it to everywhere outside of yourself. And so that you start to dehumanize everyone, and even the people that you want to love. Your love becomes the more paternal love that he describes in more detail later, rather than this consciential, or I'm consciousness making. That's what I'm gonna go with.
It's a hard word to say. Like I said, it's hard to say in Portuguese, and it doesn't exist in English. So, like, I don't blame you. It's a lot. It's got a lot of syllables. Conscientização. It's like 6 syllables. So
yes. So out of deference and respect to everyone involved, I'm gonna go with consciousness making. And forgive me for those. One day I will get beyond my USC or my US focus, and I will learn other languages and be able to practice them more fluently.
Don't
Anyway,
worry, you got time.
But the dehumanization I found in this theme of love, and how that plays a role in the consciousness making. I feel like they're all interrelated, in that love, it acts as this is going to be a bad choice of words in the moment, but it fits for what I'm saying. But it acts as a lubricant for the making of consciousness, and he actually refers to consciousness making as a birth. And so I think that, like, I can see how these overlapping themes, but that how love functions in that way is it allows and it motivates you to want to see that consciousness making in others, and in yourself, and others seeing it reflected in yourself. And I picked a bunch of random songs that actually I felt had articulated in random ways, but rather than fill this part with it, I'll just link. I'll hook Wendy up with some links, and we'll put it in the description. But
you could do like a Pedagogy of the Oppressed playlist.
Right.
You should actually next. That should be like the finale. Have like a playlist. We just have to get the rights, but yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
But so, like, for me, one of the answers when Wendy asked this question in the previous episode, one of the answers that I came towards was basically that love is raising our consciousness, making together. It's doing that, and being that, and enjoying, like, deriving our joy from both achieving it in ourselves and seeing it achieved in others. And the way capitalism and the way that the banking model and all these things work is, you can't enjoy it, the raising of consciousness in others, because of the way that the system is set up. You're penalized for that versus being rewarded for playing into all the types of slogans and the easy rhetoric that might have made this book more digestible if it was a BuzzFeed list of 10 ways to teach illiterate people or whatever. It's like how a lot of people interpreted what this book was meant to be. Right. But what Freire was after was the raising of the consciousness of the people he was hoping would read this text, and that meant lifting them to a place beyond just simply accepting or moderating the circumstances which they find themselves. And I kind of just jumped through a whole lot of things, but that we will go through the specifics, I think, when we start diving into them. But, like, you'll see how those themes pop up over and over again, and how they interplay off of each point that he's making, I guess.
Right, because everything in the book kind of builds. As I said, it's more of a layered thing. So if you miss it the first time, you'll get it like a couple pages down. He'll say it again, but in a different way, like you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also interesting because I think this overlaps very nicely with our discussion from many months ago about the use of propaganda on the left, and its need to kind of reinforce the same messages over and over, though in slightly tweaked different ways, so that people can. If you didn't understand it the first time, you might understand it the second or third time. And I think that you really see that in practice in this work, which kind of makes it so cool because it's almost an example of like communism at work in book form, which is really
Mm-hmm.
in and of itself is like pretty cool to me. The other thing too that we sort of hinted at the beginning when we were talking about the preface, because liberation theology is mentioned, which is the practice of using Christianity, and this is pretty common in both the U.S. South among civil rights organizers and people in Latin America who were attempting to free themselves from military dictatorships and the like. But they used Christianity as sort of a liberatory force, and they interpreted the Bible in what many would say were like um, ways that were more close to what Jesus was actually up to, like to
Mm-hmm.
actually, put forth a message of equality and overcoming oppression and things like that, pushing beyond oppression, I would say. But one of the things that when I was reading this chapter 1, that stood out to me so much that I absolutely loved and reminded me of like if there's anything good about the Bible, like these are certain things that I remember when I was little. I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. Like, thanks Jesus for saying that.
Right.
Was on page, I think this is like 44. It's like the second page in chapter 1, but he says, Freire himself says, that only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. Any attempt to quote unquote soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. And like this, you had hinted at in our first discussion about like the false charities and like how, rich people are engaged in what we call like philanthrocapitalism, where it looks like they're helping, but they're actually like creating a dependency and then harming the community in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes when you see like, I don't know, these people going to Africa, the country, apparently, because there are no individual countries in Africa. It's a continent, everybody. But like people who want to go to Africa and find themselves and like think they're going to help people, and then in actuality end up harming the community in many ways because they're not listening to the people. They're like enacting a policy upon them, and in many ways oppressing them as a result, and then trying to free them through furthering their oppression. So I think he does a good job in pointing this out. And what that particular line about power springing from the weak and the oppressed, I couldn't help but see the line where like, blessed are the meek for they shall inherit the earth, which is a
Mm-hmm.
line from the Bible that I like, the one that I actually care about, because I think it's one that we have to also remember in our activism, and that it's so important. Like the whole first chapter really does this, but second chapter too, in a lot of ways, because it reminds me over and over that we cannot, as activists or as people on the left or whatever, you cannot concern yourself with just telling other people what to do. And you cannot concern yourself by not listening to the people who are the most oppressed. It's basically, I mean, what he's basically saying is what you'd hear, for example, women in the Combahee River Collective say, which is like, when we're free, or when like Black women are free, everybody's free, right? And another way of putting that is when the oppressed are free, everybody is free. Like this is just people are saying the same thing, but in different ways. And this is just a particular line that for me stood out quite a bit, and I think sums up what we need to be doing on the left by understanding that liberation is not something that is top down, but is something that has to come from the language of the oppressed and from understanding and listening to their needs and letting them lead. This is, I mean, again, it seems like basic ass stuff, but there are a lot of people who don't want to listen to this and who don't understand this as a principal aspect of what being on the left means.
Yeah, the line that comes to my mind is on page 45. Who are better prepared than the oppressed to understand the terrible significance of an oppressive society?
Mm-hmm. That's
And
amazing. It's like perfect.
right, and it's just like some people are like, well, maybe the Krasenstein brothers. I don't know, maybe that. And I'm just, I mean, yeah, that's where I'm at. You know, I don't know what to do with y'all sometimes.
Yeah.
I
But
know
he
that's not
also
most of our audience.
But he also says, I mean, I think that as much as we're like celebrating this line, he also has a lot of cautionary notes throughout chapter 1, which I think are really important too, like ways to try to avoid repeating the same problems that the oppressors have left for us in a society. And so, for example, on page 45, same page that you were reading from, he said, almost always in the initial stage of struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete existential situation in which they were shaped. Okay, that's a lot. But basically, to translate that, what he's saying is like, if you grow up in a particular system that is oppressive, that's all you know, right? This is the structure that you've been conditioned by. And so when you're trying to free yourself, in the beginning, there are going to be mistakes because you're going to think about this. The only way you've learned society is through oppression. And so if that's the only language you know how to speak, your first few words are going to be that of oppression too, just repeating this type of oppression. So instead of saying, for example, like he gives examples about like revolutionaries becoming the oppressor, right? So trying not so much to free both the former oppressor and the oppressed, they focus on creating, like turning the oppressor into the oppressed. So a good example of that is like in anti-colonial movements, for example, you'll see people who are, they gain their freedom and then they may engage in practices that limit access, or I guess not access, but limit certain rights to people who are the descendants of oppressors, right? Take that for whatever you will. And I think also I understand that sentiment, right? Their sentiment makes sense. Like, of course, you don't want the oppressor to have any more power. You don't want his people to be in a position where they can hurt you again. But I think what Freire is pointing to, and again, this is like, it reminds me so much of Christianity, this idea of like turning the other cheek and all this stuff. I think what he's trying to say is like, if you want actual freedom, then everybody has to be free. And you cannot repeat the same process of trying to then create a new social strata where those who hurt you in the past are now the ones that you're hurting, because it just turns you into the oppressor. It doesn't actually free the society.
Exactly. Like, yeah, that when you're stuck in the confines of that oppressive system, that you think by flipping the poles so that the oppressed are the oppressor and the oppressor the oppressed, that somehow you've attained freedom. This is, as we see in liberal or capitalism, it's like getting wealthy. That if you go from being one of the exploited people on the line to being somebody who owns the factory, that's freedom. Like
and it's not.
Yeah, that's not free.
Yeah, it looks that, like you said, I think you even opened with this right when we first started talking about it, or maybe this was something else that I think I was talking, it was in another discussion, but like this article that's going around that's showing how there's so many women now in the military industrial complex. And it's like, that's not feminism, that's not freedom for women, that's just women entering the role of the oppressor.
Yep. And and that is not liberation. And so like these are the inherent contradictions that I found in liberal and even a lot, like I find these in a lot of somewhat progressive circles too. So this is how I tumbled into the political situation that I'm in, is confronting these contradictions, finding no solutions, finding people mad or angry that you bring these contradictions up, and finding in Freire is like, oh, this is what's going to happen. They're going to do that. and this is, you can't be afraid of those contradictions. You have to confront them and deal with them. You can't just, instantly block somebody if they, is like, but as you were just mentioning with the kind of the turn the other cheek philosophy, and then like not becoming the oppressors, he does mention, I don't know if I even highlighted it specifically, but it's ringing out in my brain, that this isn't to be confused with, preventing your oppressors from regaining power in an immediately following a revolution. And I think the kind of underlying principle and argument he's making is that by using a process of consciousness making, rather than using slogans and those types of things, in order to achieve to confront the contradiction, then that's one way that you're preventing the previous oppressors from regaining power in society. but that there also may be things that may like look to the uninitiated or to to those that haven't engaged in the dynamics of this to be oppressing the oppressor, but that we have to engage with those and be able to distinguish those, because there are going to be some times where we have to do things like, temporarily restrain or imprison somebody or something like that that's a political opponent, and it looks to be in contradiction to the principles, but there's a very real component as well. And so like I don't think he tries to resolve them, but I think he does recognize that they're there, and so that while he's advocating, like if you put him in the room about that discussion, he's probably going to be on the side that's leaning towards the turn the other cheek, but he's not going to say that the other side that's saying no, we have to lock this person up is completely wrong.
I mean, I think too, though, that he might actually say that it's completely wrong. I only say that because of what he introduces in his intro that I think we should come back to later on. This part about like making sure that the left doesn't take on right-wing approaches to securing freedom. And I think we can, like I said, we can talk about this later because I know what you're talking about right now. And I think, at least I think I do. And we should definitely discuss that in the end. We should come back to this in our third part. But I would say also, I would just counter that by going to his words, in which he says, for example, he talks a lot about what it means to be free as well, free from oppression. And I think this is interesting as well, because he's basically arguing that even our understanding of freedom has come from the oppressor, right? And that freedom in the oppressor's terms is one that sort of locks us into a fear of freedom. So it's like really, it's again, a lot of this book is like delving into contradictions. But he says on page, I think this is like page 46 or 47, that the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with, and this is super important, replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift, and it must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes a myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest of human completion. Like, holy crap. Like, this line is like so, I mean, it's a paragraph, it's not a line, but it's just so important, I think, because he's arguing for a type of freedom that we still haven't reached yet. It's one in which it's not freedom about being libertine and doing whatever you want, but it's a freedom in which you also bear a responsibility for your society, for the person that you are, for the society that you live in. And one in which you can't just, freedom is not this idea, this like kind of, an idea that's like floating around that sounds cool, but it actually has to be lived. And it has to be one that also, I mean, I've heard this in other terms and I can't think of where, but I've definitely heard this idea of freedom being responsibility, right? And making sure that it's not just an individual project of not being oppressed, but also engaging in constructing a society that is inherently not oppressive. And that a society that is transformative and that recognizes the human or the human being as a full human. Again, it goes back to this discussion we were having earlier about rehumanizing people, right? Instead of taking their humanity away, making sure that we provide the conditions in which they are full humans, and full members of a society. He also argues later on that the pedagogy of the oppressed that he talks about in this book is one, he says, quote, that must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade. So again, it's this process of like understanding that it's not our job to tell people it's not our job to say, oh, go free yourself, right? But that the oppressed will recognize this and recognize that once they understand their conditions, will take on this struggle themselves to regain their own humanity. It's not, and it, in some ways, this is kind of a contradiction because it can also make the book sound like he's like pull yourself up by your bootstraps humanity, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah,
just free yourself, like you could do it. But
that phrase came to mind earlier, but
yeah. But I think it's like, if I'm going to defend bootstrap mentality, this is the only place, maybe, because
right.
I think in this case, if you're recognizing yourself as a human being, as a contributor to society, you're recognizing what is your state of oppression. Maybe someone may have introduced it to you, but you're the one who's fully coming to terms with what your condition is. You're coming to terms with the systems that are oppressing you, and then you are coming up with the ways that are best to overthrow it. I think in this sense, it's very like Gramscian in a lot of ways too. We can talk about that later, but I think that in this case, this is the only time I would defend bootstraps ideology, because it's toward freedom and not one towards basically how to fit back into the capitalist system,
Yeah, well, and one of the things, like it go back a little bit. I think it might. I didn't put a page number right on it, but it was around the 47, 48. The quote was, "When they discover within themselves the yearning to be free, they perceive that this yearning can be transformed into reality only when the same yearning is aroused in their comrades." And it goes on to say, "But while dominated by the fear of freedom, they refuse to appeal to others." And that felt like one of those, I'm reporting this tweet because I feel personally attacked kind of moments. Particularly the second line, but I think that's an important part, though, is that you realize quickly, as soon as you start to free your mind and you start to realize these contradictions and you start to engage with it, you realize rather quickly, I think, that that individually you can only do so much, but that in order to actually change these conditions, you're going to have to have other people come to these same realizations. And what he's saying, and I think driving home the point, is that it has to be a process in which it's an engagement. Not, you can't just go tell them, hey, wake up, sheeple. Like, that doesn't work. He's like, you're gonna have to it's gonna have to be an engaging process. And he goes on later, and we'll probably get to the quote itself, but to talk about how that goes. But before I go there, I just wanted to mention that he also talks about how on page 48, how people prefer the gregariousness to authentic comradeship, which means that sometimes it's easier to go along to get along, be pleasant, be happy, than it is to Wendy took a contradictory position to something I suggested just moments ago, and it's like, it wasn't a big thing, but that's not always comfortable, and sometimes it is a bigger thing, and sometimes it's important to say those things publicly, and it's not always easy to say all those types of things. And so, like, I felt like that's a challenge to those that are trying to raise their consciousness, that you're going to be confronted. And you see this a lot with, like, whether it's confronting racism or sexism in person or online, when you see something, say something, but not in like an Islamophobic 911 white people way, in I'm seeing something wrong, so I'm going to say something and stand up for a person that's being taken advantage of, and so type of way. And so, like, those like, I think that's really important. And one of the things that I think you mentioned before about how this text was written, or asked about how this text was written, a lot of these things individually can be taken out of context, like the whole bootstraps argument, I think. But when you take it in the context of the entire text, which is a luxury of book format, is you can say, hey, no, wait, I wrote about that there too, go back to this part. That I'm harkening back to a conversation me and Wendy had off air about the format of Twitter. Sorry, it's for those that some of this doesn't make sense. Anyway, but those quotes and that process, and you mentioned the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with and not for the oppressed. I also, like, underlined and bolded, because, like, it is kind of that bootstrap argument, but when you take it in the context of what he means by forged with and not for, it becomes so pivotal to the whole rest of the argument, the whole rest of the book, I think.
And I think he kind of predates this discussion that we've been having, we as like our society in the United States have been having recently, about the, like, picking apart this idea of the ally, right? And I've seen said in a very nice way, like, don't be an ally, be a comrade, because an ally is just like looking on and like giving you a clap every now and then, like I'm cheering you on, whereas a comrade is like fighting with you, like fighting alongside, I should say, fighting alongside that person. And I think that he basically says that in a much more, like in a more depth, like in a more in-depth and theoretical way. But basically that's his argument, like don't just be an ally, like don't just do it for someone, don't just say, hey, you're oppressed, you should probably work on that, like actually fight with them, listen to them, and shape your response to oppression based on their needs. And I think he also, the other thing that's great as well, later on in this chapter on page 49, he says, with regard to the individual oppressor, that discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. Rationalizing his guilt through paternalistic treatment of the oppressed, all the while holding them fast in a position of dependence, will not do. And this reminded me so much of like the false feminist. So you see, like, the bro feminist types were like, oh, I'm super feminist, like because I know all these feminist phrases and I know the right words to say, but I'm still in my private life oppressing women in some way, right? And I think you can say the same thing about people who are like outwardly quote unquote woke or outwardly quote unquote anti-racist allies, but then they're not actually living out those practices in their everyday life. They just know the right things to say, and they don't want to get down and dirty and they don't want to feel uncomfortable. They don't like being challenged on where they too are messing up, and they're engaging in some, another good example of this too even was like Elizabeth Warren's recent debacle, because what she did is, after she was told multiple times by indigenous people that what she was doing was not okay, she then got a DNA test to appease Donald Trump or challenge Donald Trump, but then used that DNA test to then throw it back in the faces of Native Americans who were also challenging her. And it's paternalism, right? Because she's saying that I know better than you, and because she was made uncomfortable as someone who was engaged in a form of oppression. And I think I think a lot of this book, what's so great about it is like it was written in 1970, I believe, but it feels so relevant to our present state precisely because he's grounding it in so many really basic, like communist ideologies, which I think is also what makes the book worth reading, because it's like you can kind of get to Marx by reading this. You can hear Marx speaking through a lot of what he's saying, but you're also hearing all these other influences, which I think make the book really strong.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was just looking at a quote that I had picked up from there that mentions Marx specifically, that says, what Marx criticized and scientifically destroyed was not subjectivity, but subjectivism and psychologism. And it goes on to say, just as objective social reality exists not by chance, but as the product of human action, so it is not transformed by chance. If humankind wants to produce social reality, which in the inversion of the praxis turns back upon them and conditions them, then transforming that reality is a historical task, a task for humanity. Which again, whew, man, like that's,
So like break that down for us. What is he saying? Like, what does he mean perhaps by this?
This is kind of a bit of, in the page, and the surrounding text contains more, but kind of his take on a bit of ID politics and kind of the subjective view. And it's like my personal experience is valuable versus an objective reality of this is the statistical reality of what people are experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And so like what he says Marx, what he suggests Marx did was not destroy subjectivity, the value of an individual's experience, but the concept that you can either build a reality strictly off of each individual's experience, or that you can build it just based off of a larger statistical kind of analysis, that it's an interaction between the people and the world as it exists, and that we mold the world exists as we've created it. Mm-hmm. In many ways, particularly these social structures and these oppressive structures that feel feel almost natural, or we're told are facts or states of reality, or natural phenomena among humans, greed, selfishness, some of these things, like some of these concepts, like to what degree these things exist innately in our DNA, and manifest and to what degree they exist as a result of nurturing in these oppressive systems, we can't say for sure. But we do know that there's a value and an interest in a segment of society perpetuating the idea that these are inborn, these are natural states, these are beyond our control. And what he says Marx and this text essentially are doing are challenging that notion and saying that no, reality is a construction that we've made together, and just as we've built it, we can change it, and we have to believe that. And he goes on to talk about how that's the faith and the positive thinking, or some of the flowery stuff about how that goes about. But I think he grounds it in some very real concepts. But I don't want to jump ahead without covering any other selections. So.
No, I mean, I think that again goes back to like what we sort of were hinting at earlier about how he's rejecting a fatalism. So he's not, but I think at the same time, like some people, again, like with the bootstraps freedom thing, sometimes I think people can take a line like that. They can take a line like that and think it means like, don't ever talk about the past, and like, don't ever talk about how we got to the oppressive state that we're in, like, but I think I don't read him as saying like, don't recognize the past or don't recognize the state of oppression. In fact, he's arguing for us to actually understand why and how we are oppressed prior to getting to the point where we're liberating ourselves from that, right? So one of the first steps for the oppressed to free themselves is to understand the source of that oppression and to understand the history of that oppression, right? And I think that there's a real gap. Like some people don't want to grapple with that history because again, it makes them uncomfortable, right? It makes for them to have to acknowledge, this is how I am an oppressor. No one wants to be an oppressor, right? Like, no one wants to be like, oh yeah, I'm involved in like the continued oppression of another group. No one wants that. And I understand why. But I think it's also, this is part of the process that he's saying, like, you have to get beyond that. If you actually want to like work towards freedom, then you have to get beyond your own, like you have to work beyond your own state as an oppressor. You have to understand that, and you have to be willing to kind of I don't want to say renounce it, because it's not quite like the privilege argument, but like stop engaging in practices that are actually oppressing others, right? In some cases there are actual practices that people are engaging in that are oppressive, and they have to be able to acknowledge that and stop doing them. And then, as he further notes, like you have to then go along and fight alongside the oppressed and not tell them how to recognize not to see their own conditions, right? You have to fight alongside these people.
Yeah, you don't tell them standing in the street is the wrong way to protest. You go stand next to them.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly it. I think, though, the other thing that raises for me, and I sort of hinted at this in our discussion of the oppression, like one of the questions I had is like how he defines oppression, and what, like, we know what oppression means just in general, but in the first two parts and in the intro, he doesn't quite have a working definition of what oppression means. And I think this is something that he kind of unfolds. But I think this is, let me just get the page number again for those who are reading along or who want to find specific quotes. On page 55, he says, in the middle of the page, "Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called forth their existence as oppressed? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. Violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as persons, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized." So I think this is important for us to look at, because what I've recognized and seen sometimes in certain dialogues or certain discussions about oppression, and things like racism, classism, fill in the blank, one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes people rely on this sort of model in which they say there's a larger oppressor, like, for example, capitalism is the main thing that we should be fighting, and not fighting one another, which, like, yes, I agree with. But also, we have to recognize the ways that we can actively engage in the oppression of others by virtue of certain behaviors and practices. And I think we have to be careful, like, not to point only to one source of oppression, but to understand that oppression takes many different forms. And so, like, if he's saying here that never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed, then that means, for example, that, like, even if a man beats his wife, even if a man who beats his wife is poor and he's technically oppressed on the level of class, he might be the oppressor on the level of, like, his physical power in relation to his wife, right? There are all these sorts of, like, smaller examples of oppression that I think he, in some ways, is pushing us to kind of pay attention to. Like, he's saying, look at the system, but also to recognize that the system can play out in smaller, more individual examples that also interrupt the rights that others have to be human beings and human subjects. It's an act of dehumanizing others that is also that also exists in these, like, one-to-one relationships, if that makes sense. And I found myself kind of asking, like, where do we draw the line, right? Like, if someone else is also being oppressed, then are they, like, can they also be oppressed? I mean, he seems to kind of say no, but I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to read it, because he says there would be no oppressed had there not been a prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. And then he says that people who are oppressed cannot initiate violence if they themselves are the result of violence. So it almost seems like to me that he might be asking us to look at the larger systems of oppression that then recreate smaller versions of oppression. But I don't know if I'm okay. I don't know if I'm like comfortable with that, because then I say, well, what about, but, like, it's hard for me to look at this bigger state of oppression if I'm being oppressed as an individual by another individual. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it kind of left me with, like, a question mark.
Oh,
There.
I think I understand what you're saying. I guess for me, I did kind of interpret it in such the way that it seems to me he's making at least the argument that whoever, in even what I grabbed, maybe I'm just totally misreading it, is that when you have an individual case of, one-on-one oppression, that even in those situations, the oppressor in that situation isn't initiating it. Perhaps in that instance they are, but that they only exist because of this larger oppressive system. And so that doesn't absolve them of responsibility, but speaks more towards like an explanation rather than
Right.
an excuse.
Right.
And
No, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that.
and I guess that's kind of what I was pulling from that. And then also when he goes on to say that for the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, parentheses, whom they obviously never call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people, the blind, the envious masses, savages, natives, subversives, who are disaffected, and that they are the ones who are violent, barbaric, wicked, ferocious. So when they look at, high crime areas in an impoverished area, the explanation is that it's those people who are, the blind or envious masses, and they're acting barbarically, robbing and stealing and shooting, not because of the system,
Right.
but because of personal foibles in them. And I feel like what he's trying to do is he's trying to articulate a challenge to that, and suggest that no, that the violence that we see in these impoverished areas is not originating there. It originates through these oppressive systems. I guess that's what I'm
Right.
pulling.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that is, I mean, I have no doubt that that is what he's saying. But I guess maybe my question I should frame it as, like, what do we do, however, with one-to-one forms of violence, right? So if we see, for example, acts of, I don't know, racism or sexism, rape, violence, etc., that are played out by people who themselves are subjects of this oppression, right? So, like, let's take R. Kelly, for example, since he's on everyone's minds right now, because that's what we've been talking about, right? R. Kelly himself was a victim of sexual abuse, right? R. Kelly also then grew up and engaged in acts of very extreme sexual abuse towards other people. And so then, while we can say on a larger level, right, like, R. Kelly is the product of abuse that he himself was suffering, right? He's a victim on the one hand, but he's also a producer and oppressor of violence on the other. How do we kind of reconcile our discussion of systems without also, as you mentioned earlier, like without absolving? I think it's mainly just like a caution that we can do both, maybe. Like perhaps we should understand and try to eradicate these problems that oppressive systems create within our communities, first and foremost, but that we also not, that it also doesn't, I think then it kind of fits into this question of like, the caution that Freire gives earlier, where he says, if you're an oppressed person, don't become an oppressor, right? Try to actively fight that urge. And I think that that's maybe where I can kind of reconcile these two things. So like we can address systemic abuse, we can address structural abuse, but we also have to be able to address moments when people who are oppressed then turn on other oppressed people, right? And we have to be careful not to just look to systemic causes or structural causes of that, and also like, you know what I'm saying? Like, if I don't know if I'm making sense, but like we have to also fix it on these one-to-one levels. We
There needs to
can't
be
just
like an
focus on a
immediate,
larger system.
like an immediate accountability,
Mm-hmm.
like and reconciliation process that happens in the moment and at the individual level, not just in the revolution society level.
Right.
And,
Like I think that's where he kind of gives us room to do both. Like with his, like I said, with his earlier comment where he's like, if you're an oppressed person, don't engage in practices that you've learned from your oppressor. Right.
mm-hmm.
And I think this is because when we were talking about it earlier, we were talking about it more in terms of like, if you're an oppressed person and you enter into a state of power at some point, don't then oppress your prior oppressors. But we didn't talk about how like formerly oppressed people, this is so complicated because we keep using the same words, but formerly oppressed people can also then oppress other formerly oppressed or continuously oppressed people. Like this access to power question becomes a matter of like how you wield that power, and you have to be careful not to wield it in a way that repeats the violence that you yourself have been subjected to. Yeah, but I think that's how he kind of answers my question. In other words, so I tried to use Fidelity to answer my own question, but I think that's maybe how he would address that too, perhaps.
Well, and I think one of the questions that's kind of begged in that in general is that, and kind of the deeper contradiction that's a little bit harder to reconcile. I'm going to lean on Bob Marley for this, though. Is there a place for the hopeless sinner who has hurt all mankind just to save his own? So it's like, is it for the worst among us, for the most vindictive and worst people? Is there a place for them? Is there something for them? And he says, "Believe me, one love."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what he's saying, he's leaning on Freire's love and this consciousness making, in that, while maybe not in the literal sense, does that mean that everybody will come to this place, but that we have to believe that they can. And I think Freire goes back to the faith and believing, and I think that also is built heavily on the theological background that was around a lot of these movements at the time.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps also another answer to this question is not just the reliance upon recognizing the humanity of others and the need to extend love to everyone, but also this prospect of like consciousness raising. Again, like the person who is engaging in oppressive practices, despite their also being oppressed, has to just reach a point of consciousness, right? They have to recognize how they've been oppressed and how they're repeating that kind of behavior, how they're enacting that behavior upon others. Perhaps it's also a matter of that person learning and unlearning, if that makes sense, like unlearning the lesson from the oppressor. And I think with people like, again, to use R. Kelly, like he's someone who never unlearned that. Like he never went to counsel. He never got help for what happened to him. And so most likely that also explains why he continued to repeat it, and I think that is a moment where we can say maybe if there had been some sort of intervention, and some way to have R. Kelly come to terms with the violence that he himself experienced, perhaps he wouldn't then engage in enacting violence upon. I mean, we'll never know because it's too late at this point. But just something to think about. Like if we also can create, like if we could somehow create a society in which there were these moments of prevention or preventing people who have been oppressed from enacting oppression, and sort of forcing ourselves in a lot of ways, not only to recognize how we're oppressed, but the ways that we've internalized. I think this is his way of basically saying like internalized oppression, right? How can we undo those lessons? How can we unlearn that kind of behavior? And I think that's kind of the hard part, you know. And it's something that he also talks about a lot. He's like, that's one of the first things we have to unlearn. We have to unlearn, like, because he says, for example, that this is on page, it's on around 63, 64. He says, the oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor so that a contrary conviction can grow within them. Until this occurs, they will continue disheartened, fearful, and beaten. As long as the oppressed remain unaware of the causes of their condition, they fatalistically accept their exploitation. So in other words, what he's saying is like, we have to understand where the oppressor is also weak. And if not, we continue to just see that like we continue to think that our oppression is like a given. And I think that also kind of relates to what we were just talking about, because what happens is like, if you understand a weakness within the oppressor, then you can understand as well a weakness in the lesson that you've learned from them, right? In the behavior that you've taken on from them, or the behavior that you've inherited as a type of, this is what being a man is, or this is what being, you know, XYZ citizen of the society means. You should be violent, you should be aggressive, you should be sexist, whatever, you should be racist. I think if once we start to recognize a weakness in that power and that form of power, then we too can kind of we can auto-correct, you know, we can say, okay, this is what we shouldn't, this is an example of what we shouldn't be and we shouldn't replicate.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, I was just thinking, I found the quote and I realize now it's in chapter 3. That's one of the reasons it wasn't coming up so far but I just want to say part of it, just because I've mentioned it several times, so I want to get it in there, is that at the point of the encounter, there are neither utter ignoramuses nor perfect sages. There are only people who are attempting together to learn more than they know now. And dialogue further requires an intense faith in humankind, faith in their power to make and remake, to create and recreate, faith in their vocation to be more fully human. And to, you know, this is to raise the consciousness. And he also says that, you know, but it isn't a blind faith later. But we'll go into it more in the part that addresses that. But I just want to mention that just because I think that really underlines a lot of what we've been talking about so far, and really relates back to the points that you're making about how we're going to have to move forward. And I think part of the problem, going again a little bit further back to the Twitter conversation that I alluded to earlier, is that Twitter does not serve as a great platform for this dialogue and for the type of nuance that you introduced to the conversation in this situation regarding R. Kelly. In a Twitter situation, it's likely to be taken out of context or to be misinterpreted, either right or interpreted correctly as being a malicious attempt versus, you know, being trying to do what I described there, a dialogue where we're trying to further and better understand the reality of the situation and how to help everybody involved in the situation become more human, but without disregarding or taking not properly accounting for the distinctions and differences in the nature and power dynamics at play in these relationships. It's like while you know, I want R. Kelly to be able to, you know, be more human, I recognize the damage that he's done puts a priority at the people that have suffered that damage, you know.
Exactly.
And so like, and articulating those things on Twitter or in short quotes or without people who have developed a relationship or an understanding of where you're coming from in a larger sense, it becomes really hard, and that nuance is taken away. And with most people engaging in, you know, 280 characters or less at a time, and or gifts or all those types of things, and dunking on people getting more attention than, you know, thoughtful or nuanced critique, and then, you know, people that with not just, you know, with letters after their name for the sake of it, but who are both engaged academically and then materially at the level of people in the streets and how this applies, and you know, putting it into practice, in all people getting lumped together just because they say the same thing, even though they're articulating it from very different perspectives. And so like Twitter doesn't lend itself to it, but we have to. I think the text challenges us to have to find those conversations. And if we can't find them on Twitter, or we only find they constantly get interrupted, that means we're going to have to engage with people elsewhere.
Right. So now we're moving on to chapter 2. We're getting into the real nitty-gritty of the educational ideology. So Richard, why don't you head us off?
All right. Yeah. This is really the as the meat and potatoes, as some people like to call it, of what I think a lot of people pull out of Freire. And I wanted to start with just kind of a conceptual thing that helped me digest the information that was in this chapter, and also that was I think applicable to the things that I encounter today. And so what Freire is advocating for, or goes on to say is basically necessary, is dialogical engagement with contradiction, and that I think stands in juxtaposition to what we commonly hear in what I'm sure anybody who's on any social media or presents an alternative perspective to U.S. imperialism or the white hegemony, like the phrase "whataboutism," and it's, if you like Google it, you'll probably find the Wikipedia entry that attributes it to Russia, and the particular quote is basically whenever the U.S. would say anything about Russia, and they'd turn around and say, "Well, you're lynching black people or Negroes." This was the turn of phrase at the time, and like that's supposed to be an indictment of Russia, as if the United States doesn't do it. And I think even in the Wikipedia entry, it mentions Trump. But the reason why I bring all that up is because there's an important distinction there. And when you're dialogically engaging with a contradiction, it's not a reflexive call of hypocrisy, like ungrounded in the aspects of reality or tangential to what you're actually discussing. It's like that's what whataboutism is supposed to be kind of articulating. And it's like what it's supposed to be doing is investigating the themes and confronting the contradictions and raising your I'm gonna say consciousness raising together.
I think by the end of this podcast, I want everybody to know how to pronounce conscientiousation. That's my conscientiosion. But go ahead. Yes, consciousness raising.
I will practice definitely when we're not recording. But like I would just say that that's something that I think I kind of recognized when I very first got involved with this project, was that what I wanted to do, and is kind of the premise of this chapter, is I wasn't trying to say I read this text and now I'm going to teach you all what's inside of it. My goal was to share my learning experience with all of you, and so to discover this, and that somebody wrote about it, and that it was that this idea has been around, and that I could have been taught about it, caused all sorts of emotional reactions and so on and so forth. But I was kind of consoled by something that I'm just going to briefly cover, that's at the beginning of chapter 3. And rather than read you the whole quote, I'm just going to kind of pull out a piece about the intense faith in humankind, and the faith in the power to make and remake and create and recreate, because that is the only thing that can keep my optimism for when I see what's going on every day in headlines and so on and so forth, which I think we're going to come to at the end of the section. Yeah. But it's the only way I can get through it is having that faith. And, Freire mentions it's not a blind faith, but that it's still an intense faith in us to be able to remake the world as we know it. And so chapter 2, I feel, is giving us some of the most important tools that we're going to need. And so with that, I'll get into on page 72, Freire mentions, in the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing, projecting an absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as process of inquiry. And so just to relate that quickly back to this whole project is, as I mentioned before, I don't think that I have some sort of ownership of this text. I think that us reading it together, you listening to my interpretations, and ideally, the more feedback we can get, the better we're all going to absorb and raise our consciousness together. And I think that that's, again, our only defense against the oppressive, hegemony that is out there. And so when Freire describes this, I think that that's one of the most critical points. If you had a comment, Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things too that around the same place, I want to say like 72 or 73, he uses a lot of different analogies to discuss what you're describing. And so when you mentioned the banking process, the banking of knowledge as opposed to having transformative knowledge or interactive knowledge exchange, he also talks about education, quote, thus becoming an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor instead of communicating, right? So then it becomes this transactional process as opposed to one that's an actual exchange of knowledge, or as you mentioned earlier as well, like a dialogue, and something upon which people can discuss things and build upon each other's knowledge. It just becomes like one person is telling the other, and one person has to memorize and receive and be sort of a passive, not an active agent, but a passive agent in the process. I also really like too that a lot of what he's doing is he's kind of going pre-Marxian with us. So for those of you who have read Marx or are somewhat familiar with it, or even if you're not, Marx builds upon a lot of the ideas of Hegel, who was a German philosopher. Hegel is kind of an asshole and not a great person, but some of his ideas were interesting, and I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so you can see how people like Marx built upon Hegelian ideas, and then people like Freire built upon Hegelian ideas as well. And on the same page, a little bit lower, he says that the teacher presents himself to, this is in the banking form of education. The teacher presents himself to his students as their necessary opposite by considering their ignorance absolute. In other words, he just thinks you're stupid, right? He justifies his own existence through this. And the students, alienated like the slave in the Hegelian dialectic, accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence. So in other words, they accept that they're in a passive situation, right? They see the teacher as sort of needing their passivity in order to function and to kind of reiterate his power. And then he continues by saying, but unlike the slave, they never discover that they also educate the teacher, which I think is really important, and just goes back to what you were saying earlier, in the sense that it's not a one-way street, right? And what we're doing with this project is also not a one-way street. I'm bad about checking the Curious Cat, but one of the things that I do a lot actually is when I'm on Twitter, I engage with people constantly. Like I get questions about things, I get comments about things. I'm not just like posting stuff and then leaving the computer or leaving my phone. I am often interacting and trying to continue to at least learn from people in these interactions, and also do what I can to like give people resources so that it's not just me, I know everything, but like, here's what I learned here's what I can learn from you, and here's how you can learn from other places where I learned. It becomes a more interactive process instead of just me dictating.
I feel like it's a lot easier to do in person than it is on Twitter, just because it's really hard to identify people's emotion or like motives when they're like posing certain questions and or making certain arguments. And it also, I think people are less inclined to go immediately to personal insults when they're face to face with somebody and their their opinion or their worldview has been significantly challenged. But I like the theme that you point out is one that I think is very important about the kind of oppressive dynamics built into the banking education, and Freire mentions it several times. And for me, I was exposed to this very early in first grade. I just happened to have had the privilege to go to a good, preschool, So I was well ahead of most of the other kids in my class when it came to math. And so when an assignment was given, I was done long before the assigned time period had elapsed. And so it was frequently that they had to find something for me to do during that time. And it started with, something open, like, like playing, basically free time and play. And when the other kids started to, like get upset about that or cause discord in the classroom, I was put back to task to, more busy work. And that just didn't make any sense to me, because I was like, wait, this is not stimulating to me. And if you're going to give me math work, why don't you at least give me something more complicated than the stuff that I've demonstrated I'm capable of doing? And I was like, oh, this place I'm not here to be educated. I'm here for something else. And so, like, but for other people, they can make that discovery in the workplace or in a relationship or in, a variety of different places where you see these dynamics at play, or people who have developed into fitting into these dynamics take them outside of the teacher-student traditional dynamic. And so when we're going through this, I just hope that people are able to find a way to connect this material to experiences in their own life, whether it's in the classroom or in the workplace or wherever else.
Yeah.
And I one of the things I wanted to mention is he does give a kind of good breakdown of some of those oppressive dynamics in rather simple terms, with like an ABC kind of format. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. The banking, he says, the banking education, or on the contrary, banking education maintains and even stimulates the contradiction through following attitudes, practices, which mirror oppressive society as a whole.
Says and we're on page 73.
Yeah. And so it says that the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and enforces their choice and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. And the teacher chooses the program content and the students, who are not consulted, and this has always bugged me for a long time, but especially in college. I was like, wait, why does the syllabus come out after I've already in this class? Shouldn't I be able to look at every syllabus before? And this is, I went to college when that was not even remotely common. I know some colleges start to do that now, but like things like that now, and also knowing educators, I understand why, from the educator's perspective, why that happens sometimes.
Right.
But anyway, without digressing too much, goes on. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. And the teacher is the subject of the learning process, where the pupils are mere objects. And that kind of object relation, I think, is also, a throwback to Hegel. And then also Freire mentions elsewhere in the text, essentially, about describing objects and how an object exists outside of you. It's not part of you, or it's not a part of inside of your consciousness. Right. It's something you think about. And so having that dynamic, makes a person an object making a person an object rather than a person, strips them of their ability and any potential to engage in the kind of dialogical engagement it takes to better understand and shape the world.
Yeah, and the thing too that, I mean, I think this part right after the list you read actually is also really key, just to add to that. Mm-hmm. He says on the same page 73, the more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from the intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. And this part for me was like super important because you were talking earlier about how we have to really reflect on, or we should reflect on, how this work also applies beyond the educational realm and into like our personal lives and our construction as like human beings. We're walking through the world, and I think this section really these few sentences really get at that, because it basically tells us that, we've been taught and educated to be passive objects. And so then how are we expected to make, truly educated decisions? How are we expected to take in news and information in a way that we actually think twice about it, where we question things, where we consider other forms of knowledge, where we don't take things at face value when we're told? I mean, there's so many examples of this in the news right now as we speak.
The appeals to authority too, or like
yes.
by making a teacher the only source of knowledge, then it makes people are like, well, I can only get knowledge from, CNN, or I can only get knowledge from
right.
X, Y, or Z.
Absolutely.
I didn't mean to.
I think this part is like super, this what's going on page 73 is like so key for me, at least when I was reading it. I was like, yes, this is like an ongoing problem, and we have to find ways to step out of this passive role that we're expected to remain in at all times, like for the rest of our lives, and to be more actively engaged. And that's hard to do. I mean, especially because, we have lives, we have other things we have to take care of. We have to work, we have to make money, we have, fill in the blank, whatever tasks we have to engage in to survive. But in that process, we also have to make room to really, as he noted, critically engage and be critically conscious, because it's like for our own, because I guess I should say to not be critically conscious is to our own detriment, right? Because we're just told this is what you need to do. This is how things are. Accept it, call it a day, and that's really dangerous because we've seen how that plays out in real time when we just are told to accept things and we do,
And I think Freire mentions, and he describes it in several ways, but we talked a little bit in the lead up to this covering this text, and also in part one about a little bit about love, and I think this is what he's talking about when he says that engaging in this kind of dialogue is an act of love, because when you recognize the oppressive nature of the teacher-student dynamic, or the banking model, or whichever way you're wherever you're applying this, you realize that the when you're trying to help someone raise their consciousness or raise consciousness together, like you're doing something that's like on par with feeding a hungry person that you just a hungry stranger. It's an act of love because that the person needs not necessarily just help, but is in need, and you have something of excess in which you can help provide, and whether that's time, whether that's food, whether it's conversation, whatever that is. It's an act of love to share that with somebody so that you can help both understand and reshape your world together better. And so like that kind of profound love is the type of love, when I mention that, it's not the love heals all wounds, the like the kind of superficial love that may be talked about in more, or maybe more popular or conceptualized in most people's minds. And so I figured this is a good time to talk about that. And on page 74, Freire mentions, indeed, the interests of the oppressors lie in changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. Yes. The more the oppressed can be led to adapt to that situation, the more easily they can be dominated. And I think it's critical here, just because it's easy to get confused when he says changing the consciousness. It's like, wait, isn't that what we're trying to do? It's like, no, when he's describing changing the consciousness, that's not the same thing as raising the consciousness. What he's talking about there is adapting your consciousness to accept the oppression, to accept the teacher-student dynamic, to meekly wait to be filled with information, because the teacher can't teach if we're always interrupting her with contrary information, like slaves aren't immigrants or whatever. So we we have to just sit meekly and listen to her articulate the reality and just absorb it. That makes us a good student. And so like obviously that naturally fits into an oppressive dynamic in which they want to dominate you. And so like that really stuck out to me. And so that's when Freire says changing the consciousness, and that is very distinctly different from raising a consciousness. And I can't help but notice how emblematic that is, especially from my perspective of the Democratic Party. They are very happy trying to change how you feel about the oppressive situation rather than the actual oppressive situation itself. And that when I say that this chapter helped me understand things, that was one of the key passages that really helped me understand why things are the way they are. And it's not necessarily malicious. Like, you don't have to be malicious in this. Being a good student growing up would make you a prime candidate to enforce this type of oppression.
But I think on a similar note, when you were talking about the Democratic Party, and one of the things that stood out to me is, some of them have gotten better at the language of oppression as well, like articulating what oppression looks like sometimes, but then not doing anything to change the structures that enable that oppression. And sort of in the right in the middle of the page, he says, quote, "The truth is, however," or sorry, he says at the beginning of that part, these marginals, so he's talking about marginalized people, need to be, quote, integrated or, quote, incorporated into a healthy society that they have, quote, forsaken. So he's saying this is the mentality that some people have when they see oppressed people as pathological examples of, quote unquote, healthy members of society. He goes on to say, quote, "The truth is, however, that the oppressed are not, quote, marginals or people living out, they're not people living outside of the society. They have always been inside the structure that made them, quote, beings for others. The solution is not to, quote unquote, integrate them into the structure of oppression, but to transform that structure so they can become beings for themselves." And I really like this. And I think it kind of made me think about, again, what you were saying about the Democratic Party. So this idea that, you take poor children and you bus them to a better school instead of like fixing the schools in their neighborhoods, or you give people vouchers to go to private schools or what. I really thought of the literal education system when he was talking about this, because in many ways we've seen that integration, even on a racial front, has not actually improved the outcomes for poor Black students, for example, just to give one example of many. What we end up seeing is they're kind of forced into a system that doesn't accommodate them well, that doesn't take note of whatever issues they're dealing with. It doesn't work to change the situation at home. It doesn't work towards changing or fixing any, learning disabilities or any sort of issues that the child is having. It's just this idea that you can just take someone out of their environment, put them in another environment, and then everything will be fine. And it makes the assumption that the other environment is healthy and that their environment is the one that's flawed and has all these problems, when in actuality, like, they're not considering, in some cases, they being people who are encouraging things like charter schools and whatnot, they're not considering how, with a few tweaks, the home environment in this case being the school, can be fixed, can be changed, can be made better for the students. And it's not a matter of like bringing in, teachers from the suburbs to fix, quote unquote, the teachers in these inner city areas. Like, it's never that. And I think, as I said, the outcomes show that this is not quite the answer. And that instead of, uprooting, we'll work towards improving the local schools and fixing the problems that they have there. And also not just coming in and saying, this is what you need to do, but understanding that, like, the community members know what they need. And so you have to listen to them and understand what they want their schools to look like, what they want teaching to look like, and then go from there, as opposed to, you know what I mean? Like, it becomes a sort of internal imperial and like domestic imperialism, what we see happening, with a kind of outside influence or outside person telling a local community what they, quote unquote, need, instead of listening and having them tell these outsiders what they need and want for themselves.
Mm-hmm. No, and to give an international example that comes to my mind is water projects throughout Africa. Like, that is, any like research into how those have worked out will show you that oftentimes what ends up happening is the actual needs of the community aren't considered, or the sustainability of the project isn't considered. And so what was meant to be or at least I'd like to hope at least, is meant to be a good faith and good natured attempt to help people that need it, ends up becoming either a burden or just an embarrassment, or some other, like, it has negative ramifications on the society because they weren't consulted or really engaged with it, or with what the issue was and what would make sense for them to solve it, or they end up with a well that's miles away, or whatever, and so I think that this is excellent and kind of highlights that. And you gave an excellent domestic example. And I think that we see lots of examples of people talking about this at the time as well. And so, like, beyond Freire as well, like, we really got robbed by not learning more about the revolutionary movements throughout the 60s, both domestically and internationally. At least I did in my public education.
Yeah, and we're all of us, I think, not just public, but like all, because I went to private school. I have to say, like, I went to private school, but on scholarship. But, I didn't learn about any of that stuff either. I mean, I learned about all of this stuff when I was in college and then later grad school. It wasn't something that, was part of we hardly even really talked about slavery. And I went to one of the best schools in my city, but we missed out on a lot of aspects of historical education. And I'm thankful that there are people like Freire and others who wrote things down, at least. So as an adult, I could go back and look at them and understand, okay, this is how other people thought at the time. And this is how they challenged systems that we're still contending with to this day. But this serves as some sort of guidance for us to perhaps move forward and do even more into the future, hopefully.
The next selection I had was on page 78. So if you had anything before that you wanted to mention.
No, I'm good. Go ahead.
All right. The next thing I wanted to mention is kind of addressing. I can imagine for most people this has evoked some sort of emotion of frustration or anger, or whatever, a feeling like you can't do anything. And Freire actually mentions that on page 78 when it says, when their efforts to act responsibly are frustrated, when they find themselves unable to use their faculties, people suffer. This suffering due to impotence is rooted in the very fact that the human equilibrium has been disturbed. But the inability to act, which causes people's anguish, also causes them to reject their impotence by attempting to do something about it. My quote actually got cut off, so apologize for that. But but I think what Freire's saying there is that a lot of the frustrations that we feel, the anger and the just anxieties and a lot of the emotions that we feel are a direct result of this interference with our desire and need to be more complete and more fulfilled human beings by better understanding and shaping our world. The banking depositing method of how our world works and the grueling natures of capitalism results in stripping this away from us. It strips away our ability to stop and think about, well, hey, this thing that I do 8 hours a day, is it ethical? Is it helping humanity? Am I helping a corporation exploit some marginalized person? Like, it's hard to, like, the whole system is designed to keep you from engaging with that. And like from the very beginning, when it comes to even just questioning your teachers, the whole system is designed to ostracize anybody who doesn't fit in, who isn't trying to adapt to the system, who isn't trying to kill that part of themselves that wants to ask, wait a minute, why are we the wealthiest wealthiest country in the world, but there's people sleeping outside and people not getting with kids without access to food? That doesn't make any sense. Like, well, you can't challenge that contradiction or really analyze it, because, well, then you might end up discovering that capitalism is the reasons for that. And that, and I mentioned earlier before, it's not always just malicious. Like, being a good student, being successful at adjusting to the oppressive society is rewarded. You get economic compensation for sacrificing that part of yourself. The more you sacrifice, generally, the more you can make. Like, the less empathy you have towards your fellow human being, the more capital that will help support your cause, the better, and especially the better you are at covering that lack of empathy with false empathy or the paternal kind of billionaire donation scheme.
Right.
Well, it's just like, so with that in mind, when I read, that, one of the things that popped up to me was Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, I'm proudly maladjusted. This is, I feel like, what he was talking about. I don't know to what extent he was familiar with this writing, if at all, but the same idea was being expressed, that discordance that you feel just by existing in the society isn't a problem with you so much as it's a problem with society. And one of the things I discovered in thinking about this and discussing this material with other people is that a lot of aspects of society are built in this way, as in to outcast, to subjugate, to oppress, to marginalize any view that doesn't fit, or any anxiety that results in the participation of this oppressive system. And so like you can see this in the medical field, you can see this in at the workplace, you can see this in education, you can see this in politics, you can see this any direction you look, you see the same kind of oppressive dynamics. And what I liked about this text is this gives us a practical alternative if you can recognize it.
Mm-hmm. I think too that around that same page, and it goes back to something that I've been trying to like find some theory on, that I've always had this idea. I mean, not always, but like recently I've been kind of thinking about trying to develop this idea about capitalism breeding mediocrity, right? Because often there's a discussion that we've seen over and over about like how socialism or communism crushes creative thought and creative pursuits and whatever, when in actuality, if you consider that if people have their basic needs met, they then have the time and the energy to pursue, creative things and things that go beyond just working in order to survive.
Polio vaccine. That's all I can say when people say stuff like about capitalism. That
what did you say? It's totally what?
The polio vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
Turned down estimated around $7 billion because no, I actually just made this thing to help people. Why are you trying to turn it into something worth $7 billion?
Okay.
Go on.
No, I didn't know this backstory, but that's interesting. But yeah, I think it's around I believe 77 or 78 as well, where he starts talking about this idea of like oppression itself and control and all of these kinds of limiting forms of education, like the banking concept of education, et cetera. It's all part of this oppressive model that then focuses more on killing things, on death, than it does on creation, on love, on sparking new things. And at the end, he talks about how a form of work, our form of just like living in our everyday in capitalist existence, right? He goes to say, quote, "It attempts to control thinking and action, leads women and men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power." And I think we see that in real time all the time. I think we have, in many cases, we're working to live. We're not, and then people are living to work too. I mean, it's all a cycle. And I don't think there's very much space, not only to question, but there's also not very much space to create and to come up with new ideas. And most importantly, to have a kind of political imagination. This is something you and I were talking about a little bit before we started recording. But we keep seeing over and over that people are just settling for what's there and what we think is all we deserve, because and for whatever reason, we've been sort of, not only have we been kind of, how would you say this? I mean, we've been conditioned technically to think in this sort of limited way, and to think and to see the space of our potential as itself limited, but also to see the space and potential of the society in which we live as limited, which is just as dangerous, if not more so, because we say, well, these politicians who don't care about us or who are directly harming our communities are thus our only options, and therefore we have to support one of them. We have to vote for one of them. We have to, donate to one of them. It's not sustainable at the end of the day. And it's something that continues this process of oppression, and it continues this process of not only murdering us, killing us physically, literally. We have people dying because they don't have healthcare. We have people dying because they're overworked. We have people dying because they're not getting decent food access, all these things. But then also killing whatever is left of our brains, like it's taking away our ability to think critically and to question and to challenge the world as we see it. So yeah, I think that section is also super important.
Yeah, so I mean, just trying to take away in my view, a lot of what makes us human, and really turn us into the objects that Freire describes, and that I think a lot of the top top wealthy echelons of society would rather imagine us, so that as objects, it's a lot easier to both exploit and then to celebrate your own recognition of their humanity on occasion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot easier if people are objects to exploit them for profit and then pat yourself on the back for giving a little bit of that profit back to them. And so one of the things I thought on page 79 that kind of stuck out to me, and I think is towards what I mentioned at the top about the practical application of this text, is Freire says, liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it, and that those truly committed to the cause of liberation can accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor use of the banking methods of domination, propaganda, slogans, deposits. I think Freire's using the more bourgeoisie kind of connotations of propaganda here. In the name of liberation. Those truly committed to liberation must reject the banking concept in its entirety, adopting instead a concept of women and men as conscious beings and consciousness as consciousness intent upon the world. And they basically goes on, and he repeats this several times, but they must reject this banking model and instead choose a problem posing or dialogic contradiction examining education. And this is, I think, where a lot of people, I know myself included, have struggled to kind of wrap our minds around. It's like we see the effectiveness of shaving the truth or manipulating media or whatever kind of deceptive bumper sticker type slogans and those types of things. We see the effectiveness of those, and it's really hard, or the obstinance of the Republican Party or whatever it may be. It's really hard not to want to imitate those because we see how effective they look.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Freire challenges us to that and says essentially what I've heard from Miss Lord, which is you can't tear down or paraphrasing here because I'm going to butcher it, but you can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools. And so I feel like Freire is suggesting that banking education model is one of the master's tools, and if you by employing that model in trying to inform the proletariat or trying to engage in consciousness raising, you become self-defeating. That in imitating the model, you reinforce the same hierarchical relationships between those with the knowledge and those without it that sustain the very system that we're trying to disrupt.
I mean, yeah. And that's like, I know that's so basic, but I am agreeing because there's pretty much the way he says it and then the way you paraphrase it is clear. Maybe call me a receptacle in this case, or a deposit receiver, because I'm listening. But I think that it's accurate, and I think that we have to. I mean, again, just thinking of personal examples and the way we live our everyday lives, the question then becomes, we've already talked about the challenges of that system. How do we then get beyond the banking model of knowledge? I've seen, I think we've had discussions in education and people who study pedagogy and things like that lately. For those of anyone who's been to high school or college in the last 5 to 10 years, you'll know that there's a lot more interactive engagement. Professors are doing more conversation-based classes. Teachers are using more interactive methods to get their students to think outside the box, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then my challenge then to perhaps these applications of Freirean models of pedagogy, the challenge that I would raise is then, are we recreating or are we kind of recreating a banking system of knowledge by using seemingly liberatory practices? And by that I mean, just to clarify, are we, even if we have conversation-based classrooms, or if we let the students pick or add a specific text to the syllabus or whatever, are we still reinforcing some of the same models? Because ultimately we still have grading. Ultimately we still have a limit on the conversations that we have. We have a limit on the perspectives that we engage. In some cases it's a question of safety, right? We can't have people spouting, white supremacist thought during in a classroom discussion and accept it. But I mean, in terms of challenging, for example, politicians or certain frames of thinking and ideology. And it's something that I've also run up against because I've had professors that I very much admire spout, centrist neoliberal style politics in a way that like runs counter to what they teach on an everyday basis or what they read on an everyday basis. So then the question becomes like, how much are we still, even if we have this veneer of like going beyond the status quo, how are we still kind of reinforcing it in our own way? I guess like how do we know if we're following Freire that we're fully meeting the needs of the student? Even if we're listening and we're applying these new methods, how do we know that we've reached that goal?
Mm-hmm. Where this manifests in my mind as like black capitalism movements, and
yes,
where like that's what comes to my mind. Is like, wait a minute, it's like black capitalism isn't solving the liberation problem.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't solve that. It just creates a different class of oppressors.
That's a really good example.
Yeah, and it's like I for one have been supportive of the concept of black capitalism, and I still can't really be too negative on it because of the general concept of the practicality of liberation movements can't be robbing banks at this moment. So if you're going to fund a liberation movement, black capitalism is one of the seems like a viable, like one of the more viable options. Like there's not, it doesn't. One of the few things that I'm not able to pull out of this text is something that addresses that aspect, the material conditions necessary in order to achieve liberation and achieving that without these oppressive systems. But and so I see this. It's easier to be critical of the educational philosophy aspect of it. It's harder to be critical of how we see the same problem in same dynamics at play in black or like any sort of black organizations that are looking towards liberation but are taking in any sort of significant money. Mm-hmm. And so if it's like, are these organizations, are they imitating the same hierarchical oppressive structures that they're allegedly trying to fight against, or are they attempting to use their political imagination to envision new things or take notes or points from other organizations and structures that could help them not be reinforcing those kind of hierarchical and oppressive systems? And Wendy mentioned earlier, and we were talking before we started recording a bit about political imagination. And for me, that's kind of where I saw, and some people may have not seen it, and I'll qualify it by saying that there's plenty of problems with it, but Killer Mike's Netflix thing, where he, kind of basically just tried some outrageous ideas, and I guess having looked into it a bit, that some of them may have been staged and stuff, but to the point that liberation is praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. I feel like that was the value in what Killer Mike did, was it exposed us and stimulated our political imagination. He did things that people told him to his face, you can't do. And he's like, watch me, and just did it. And it's like, maybe he had to stage some of it or whatever, but just doing that opens people's minds, I feel, to the possibilities of, hey, I mean, yes, climate catastrophe is on the horizon, and nobody with political power has any plan to do anything that isn't going to cause, billions of people to suffer. That's just the fact of the matter. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can imagine a future that averts that disaster, but we have to work at it. It's praxis, mm-hmm. and we have to inform ourselves, educate ourselves, and learn. And the problem for us is that we're on a deadline. We only have so much time before the consequences are so dramatic and so irreversible that survival becomes a priority over any sort of political organization. And
I think part of it too feels like, part of it to me, I think in terms of solutions, it feels like almost that you have to pursue a kind of anarchic model, right? And because if we have systems that are inherently flawed and we still rely on, I mean, I was talking about this the other day on Twitter too, like if we still rely on those systems, it's like, this is the trap, right? We we need to get, like, the systems oppress us and the institutions oppress us, but in order for us to file a grievance or to be remunerated for damages or to have some sort of solution, we still have to rely on the same institutions, more or less. And the other problem is, when we talk about, for example, alternative parties or third parties, those parties also have internal structural issues. They have similar problems of racism, classism, fill in the blank. And you also see a kind of hierarchical structure. And so things, even if they're the alternative, they have a tendency to, and we talked about this in the first part of this discussion as well, when we talked about like revolutionaries who unfortunately sometimes inhabit and then enact the behavior of their oppressors that they had just overthrown, right? I think we sometimes unfortunately have to grapple with this and still grapple with this. And I'm wondering, what kind of, is our solution then going to need to be a moment of anarchy where we just tear everything down and we rebuild and we restart? And I think you can see historical examples of that where people, and even contemporary historical examples of that, where, like, for example, in Greece, anarchists were doing a lot more work than the government was to help migrants, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, I also, like, for example, when Trump was elected, I kept saying, like, anyone who has any particular skills, whether they be legal, medical, psychological, whatever, you need to just go beyond the system. Like, screw having to work out of an office, go work out of your house and, like, have people come to you for free, like, give medication to people for free, take from the off, like, rob the office. You know what I'm saying? Like, do something to challenge what is the norm, because you're going to have to go beyond the system, because the system right now, and most of the time, has not been checking for you. Like, they're not going to help you. If you have a president that, gives tax breaks to the wealthy and screws over all people who require, prescription meds, and you're a doctor, you're in a position where you can literally help medicate people off the record. You know what I mean? So there has to be some sort of, I think our most conscious response is going to be one that goes beyond the systems that we know and understand. And that's going to take a lot. It's going to be uncomfortable. Might be one of the only ways for now for us to really, truly challenge these systems that we've been critical of.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the challenge for those that feel that way becomes then, like, how do we identify allies or people that are close to coming to these similar realizations or feelings but aren't there yet, and then how do we distinguish them from those that are either just too stubborn or actually are aware of all of this, like understand these dynamics and have just chosen the other side. Like,
and that I don't have an answer for.
Right, and it's not as though that people can't seemingly flow from one to the other, like, and that, as Wendy mentioned before, that even revolutionaries can become oppressors, and so nobody is immune. It's always it's work, and it's not just it's we are addicted to capitalism and addicted to the systems that are around, and so, like any addict, it's going to be a daily thing to fight that addiction. It doesn't matter how long we're sober as an individual, or clean from capitalism as a smaller community, as like a commune or anything like that. None of those give you an immunity to the deeper hegemonic addiction to these systems. And so it's going to take very conscious effort and lots of praxis, both practice and praxis of these types of engagements and interactions with each other and with people on the edge, to both better understand why they don't see it the same way as Wendy or I may be articulating, and what it would take for them to see it that way. Like, people that are willing or able to engage with those edge cases and don't get frustrated or just want to say, oh, okay, whatever, you're fucking imperialist. like the people that have the patience to deal with that, it's very valuable to then bring that to the conversation in a way as to not be emboldening the case for whatever it may be, imperialism, white hegemony, whatever, but to be saying, this is how they are viewing this situation, and this is how they want it resolved. So if we want to help them understand why that doesn't work or why this is better, this is where we need to approach the situation from. And so, like, one of the things that I've seen a lot recently is just a lot of overlap between critics or like critiques of the Democratic Party that you don't know if you don't click and look whether the person who said it is a Trump supporter or somebody far to the left of the Democratic Party. And like, liberals will be like, oh, horseshoe, there it is. Like, but no, what I feel like that demonstrates is a potential possibility of exposing a common realization. And so maybe 99% of those people that are doing that are a Trump supporter, but then like a comment critical of the Democratic Party, are essentially relatively unsalvageable from like a far leftist perspective. I hate to say that, and I would put 1,000 qualifications on that, but I think people understand what I mean. That 1% of that few people is like those. If you have love for humanity, those people are worth saving, or worth helping, or worth sharing consciousness with, and helping us both understand our realities better, so that neither one of us are being stifled or oppressed by the system, whether we're supporting it or not. And so, like, for me, and I guess this is one of the things I have an abundance of when I compare myself to other people, is a level of empathy for some of the most oppressive people in the system, and recognizing how the system oppresses them as well, and prevents them from being complete people as well, which Freire touches on as well in the text. But that really stuck out to me, is that, and has always been an issue for me, is how do we appeal to a billionaire other than cutting off their head? Because like, right. I understand the feeling, but I really like to avoid that, because that doesn't feel like that aligns with my morals or my ethics or my ideology. Like, I understand the sensation, the emotion, and sometimes even the justification, but I would really love to have a philosophy and a political philosophy that gave me something besides a guillotine for a billionaire. And so I think Freire does that by articulating the oppression, or like how the oppressive dynamics, by being an oppressor, you haven't liberated yourself either. So even right. even the people at the top of this oppression hegemony, they're not free either. And like, their oppression is different, and it looks pretty nice comparatively to like a lot of living conditions, but there's a reasons why you can find people in the most destitute parts of the world with smiles on their face all the time, and you can find some of the most depressed people on the planet in the most lavish of surroundings. It's because the fulfillment of your consciousness isn't something that you can achieve through capitalism, and capitalism doesn't reward it. And so that's why I believe you can find a lot of happy people that are of little means, and a lot of unhappy people that have more means than you can imagine.
Right. I mean, one of the very clear examples that I can give is Brazil, actually. Like, major cities in Brazil, there have been very good books written about this particular like phenomenon. But and if you go to very large cities in Brazil, like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, these areas, what happens is you'll notice that wealthy people live in like forts. But basically, they have barbed wire, security cameras, tiny windows. They live in these high rises that, like, you like, they have maids and gardeners and all these things, like these people in their house nonstop all the time. They never have any real privacy. They never have any real sense of peace, because, and they drive around in like bulletproof windowed cars and things like that. And it's a kind of, it's a protected existence, but it's also like a self-policed existence. They can't just live free because they live in constant fear of being robbed or being harmed in some way. And like, I don't feel sorry for them. So just to make that clear to anyone listening to this, I'm not saying pity the rich, but my point is to say that they too are, they're living in a prison of their own making, right? Because they've either inherited or created so much wealth for themselves, or stolen so much wealth for themselves, to be honest. And they're hoarding it. And this is their way of protecting it. But their way of protecting it means that they have to give up an aspect of their freedom. And, I think that very clearly touches on what you were talking about earlier and what Freire touches on in the first part of the book, where he gives the examples of, the oppressor or the seeming oppressor is also being oppressed. In some cases, it's not necessarily on the same level, of course, but it is something that is detrimental to his or her health and well-being and like adjustment in a healthy society. Something similar I wanted to bring up, or not similar, but I would say something that kind of touches on what we were talking about before about, how do we know when we've reached the point where we can say like, this is real freedom, or this is a real engagement of like breaking down systems that harm us. I want to say this is page, let's see, let me check the page. It is page 81 at the bottom. He says, quote, education as the practice of freedom denies that man is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from people. Authentic reflection considers neither abstract man nor the world without people, but people in their relations with the world. In these relations, consciousness, now I can't say it in English. In these relations, consciousness and world are simultaneous. Consciousness neither precedes the world nor follows it. And I think this is interesting too, because we, at least speaking as someone on the left, and I think many leftists do this, we get caught up in this sort of abstract idea of the world, right? We have a sort of idea of what we want, and then we operate in a way that as if we're living already. And then at the same time, you have some people who are so attached to the world and so focused on the material reality that they can't see, they don't have the imaginative aspect, right? And I think that this discussion on this page, where he kind of is talking about how to merge the two and how we have to understand and see people as they connect to their material realities, as they connect to these systems, as they connect to the world, and discuss them accordingly and talk about solutions accordingly, right? So while in many cases, most of us want a, full communism now, right? Like revolution now, guillotine everybody and start from scratch. We unfortunately, I guess you could do it, but it may not yield a real moment of reflection and understanding of what to do next. And I think that this and throughout the book, actually, because we already discussed this somewhat from the first part, he really does keep reminding us over and over that like, you have to be grounded. You have to understand the way people live. You have to understand what's going on in people's lives, how they're dependent upon and working within these systems, and what we can do to not just see people as abstract, but also to think about them as I said, like people who are interacting with systems, people who are relating to one another and relating to these different conditions and how to work with that. I don't know. I think that part was like really interesting. Like, I like the line, education as the practice of freedom, thinking of education as something that is part of this freedom making process, right? The conscientization. It's kind of nice and well said, I think.
Yeah, for all the glorification of freedom, I find conscientious to be a much better reflection of freedom than having a gun.
It depends on who you ask, but
yeah. Well, I'm working on both. It's like I'm not giving up one or the other, but
right.
I just, as far as like you can get a lot of Republicans to like talk about how much they're freedom loving, patriots, but then like if the freedom involves challenging the white, hegemony, then well, wait a minute, that's not freedom, that's oppression.
Right.
You're oppressing us unfortunate white males. Stop pointing out that blackface in 1984 is offensive.
Yeah, for anyone who's if you're getting onto this late, we're talking about Ralph Northam. Yeah. He's currently still the governor of Virginia, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just a quick transition, we've been hinting at it here and there throughout the episode, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the news right now that is related deeply to what we've been discussing in the book. On a variety of fronts, we've touched on some environmental stuff. We've also touched on gubernatorial politics as they relate to racism and things like that. But yeah, I think, again, we were talking about this off air a bit, but at present, as we are having this discussion, the U.S. has been engaging in really shady dealings with Venezuela. And regardless of how you feel about Maduro, that's kind of irrelevant if you have a country, a strong foreign power like the U.S. really set on invading another country and it taking away its sovereignty. And I think, one of the things that I've grappled with or been challenged with over the past few days as this is unfolding is the fact that, some people will say, oh, well, you're an American, you're from the US, you don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, but I do know what I'm talking about. I am actually doing the research. I'm going beyond what we're told in the media, and even in the media where they're going beyond. There are some examples for the Washington Post, the New York Times, very standard, sometimes right-wing even political newspapers that discuss politics, and they're even laying out that this is clearly being orchestrated by the United States, and there are all these steps that Mike Pence and Trump have been taking over the past few months and to sort of enable this really rough transition, which I would argue is a coup between the power that Maduro has under the previous elections and the potential power that Guaido will possess if he takes over as president of the country, as several other countries who are all implicated because they're right-leaning and they want Venezuela's oil, et cetera, who have supported him. So I think it's a challenge at this moment, actually. I'm having one of those moments where I'm like, no, I'm not going to just follow what the teacher says, because the teacher in this case, if you're going by mainstream media, if you're going by certain government powers, whether they're in the US or abroad, are saying, no, this is the story. This is what's happening. But once you actually challenge that and you go and do your own research, you start to really see that it's not quite the way it's being presented in the news. And it's certainly not, once you understand Venezuelan history, it's certainly not a case of, one guy's oppressing his people and the U.S. wants to do something about it, but instead a continuation on a very long historical continuum of U.S. imperial power, European imperial power in Latin America, and the scramble for its resources.
Mm-hmm. I feel like even liberals should understand that our president is Trump.
Right.
you guys remember Puerto Rico? How in the world could you possibly imagine that anything we're doing for Venezuela is a humanitarian effort? How?
Right.
How do you maintain that idea? You have to know that at least at a minimum, so long as Donald Trump is in charge of it, it is anti-humanitarian. There's just no way to reconcile any sort of consistent critique of Donald Trump and then also support him appointing a convicted war criminal to oversee our influence in Venezuela, regardless of whether you can envision it as a U.S. orchestrated coup or something less. That as a liberal, there's just no way that you can have a consistent worldview or ideology and arrive at that conclusion, in my view. And so
right.
it's just think for a moment. I mean, I'm sure most people that listen to us are farther to the left, but I'm sure that there's some people that are just getting exposed. Just think about how little criticism, or just the media that will look at Donald Trump walking up to his jet to catch him with toilet paper on his shoe and run that for hours, hasn't been able to manifest much of a critical look at what Trump is doing and why it might be extremely problematic. It's just starting to get there now that they've realized that the initial attempt at the coup wasn't very successful. Anybody that considers themselves a thinking person, I feel has to really be challenging what they've seen in the media and the coverage, and just how it doesn't align with just how the media has covered the last 2 years. It just doesn't match.
Right.
And so that has to drive questions. And then when you start to look for those answers, you discover very quickly that it is what it looks like. It is the U.S. in my opinion, it is the U.S. orchestrated coup for oil.
Right. And it's not even, at this point, like I said, it's not even a matter of opinion when you have the Washington Post showing you these are the steps that Mike Pence took to do this, right? Like, this is not, I mean, it's,
yeah, they're just basically celebrating it or like ambiguous about it. Like, well, this is what's happening. It's not, now they found their journalistic objectivism for this, that
right.
they like, now they found it.
But at least they're putting it out there, you know, like it's like there's no hiding what's going on. I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that even the most centrist / right-leaning you know, magazines and newspapers are literally saying to you, this is what is happening. So like, don't misunderstand. Don't try to read between the lines. They're telling you what's going on. You don't even have to guess. Like, it's like, it reminds me of the situation with the students, the Covington high school students and the indigenous man. And like, people, they're there with the MAGA hats. Like, there's nothing else to guess, guys. Like, first of all, you know what I mean? Like people are like, well, maybe they're not racist, or maybe, like, there's no guessing. Like, I'm looking at what I'm seeing, right? I'm looking at them at a pro-life, I don't even like the anti-choice rally. I'm looking at the nature of the school and its history. I'm looking at the MAGA hats and their support of Trump, who, yes, is a racist president and a racist person and a classist person and an imperialist. And you're telling me that this conflict is not driven by racism? Okay, like, let's look at the sky and call it blue or call it red. Which one is it, right? Is it blue or red? It's freaking blue. So right now what's happening is, like, we are being told by the mainstream press, when they never really do this. It's very rare that they do this. They're literally laying it out for us. They're saying that, you know, for example, Trump threatened one of the opposition leaders not to run. So then in this last election, what happened was he threatened sanctions against one of the opposition leaders who was going to run for office. And so that's why you saw that the opposition in Venezuela did not run in this last election. That was a kind of curiosity moment. They were like, for several months, I remember hearing people say, it's weird that the opposition didn't even run. And then they complained that the election wasn't democratic because they weren't involved, but they're the ones who chose to sit out. Well, now we know from these mainstream outlets that Trump actually threatened one of the opposition leaders who was set to run, so that they didn't run. Then the other thing I keep hearing is, oh no, this is constitutional. What Guaido is doing is fine. But then when you go and actually look at the Constitution, which, hey, you can do, and you can see that it does, his usurping of, or attempt to usurp power, even as interim president, does not necessarily fall under the guidelines of like the emergency use of this Constitution. Like, it would not fall under the categories under which, or the criteria under which, someone could take over as president of the country. And then the other thing too that was weird to me is, like, there's no real discussion of training that Guaido received. There's no discussion of how he's not well known in the country. There's no discussion of the fact that, like, half the people, or like, I think they said like 80% of the people polled at the time of Guaido's taking on this position as quote unquote interim president, they didn't know who he was. He
didn't even have a popularity rating from some of the local pollsters before this happened. Not even a popularity rating.
And you can argue, for example, you could say, okay, well, those polls are all run by Maduro or by Chavistas or whatever. Okay, fine. Let's take that argument and go with it. Even then, you have people who supported Guaido, who are living in Latin America, who are Latin American presidents, who speak Spanish fluently and it's their native language, who don't even know the man's name, who can't even pronounce his name as they're expressing support of his presidency. So I'm sitting here like, wait a second. And then the other thing is, like, his praise of Bolsonaro. He is a fascist. Like, anyone who's been paying attention, who's not like a member of the KKK or a far right person, you can see that he's not a supporter of human rights, which is what Guaido praised him for in the tweet. Like, look at what is happening. Assess it with your own eyes. You don't have to listen to me. Go look at articles. Go look at articles from any outlet and just piece together the evidence. And then you tell me that if this were happening any other place, if it were involving any other president, that we would be okay with it. Like, would it be okay if Trump had done this to Macron? Right? Because we say, okay, Macron has people mad at him. There are people protesting in the streets, all accurate. There's an economic issue, accurate. You know, he's been cracking down on some of this. I'm using arguments that are used about Maduro, right? He's been cracking down on his, on people protesting. Okay. So then would we be okay with Trump invading France and telling like Marine Le Pen to announce her, she's the far right candidate, to announce herself as president overnight? Would we be cool with that? Like, would it be cool? Like, you have to ask yourself these questions.
But Wendy, these people are brown and poor, so
and that's another thing for a whole other day's discussion.
Right.
But also the people who are like in our mentions and in our discussions about Venezuela, like one of the things that I've noticed, and you can't help but notice it, like you cannot help but notice it, anyone who's commenting to me either in English or in Spanish is white, upper class, because in order for you to have stable internet access, Twitter access, to be able to write in English, you're most likely upper class in Venezuela. Let's just keep it real. Or you're an expat, you're living abroad, which in that case you're safely removed from anything that could happen during a U.S. invasion, which we know how those go. They never go great, right? Like they have
collateral damage, also known as like human children and women and men and boys, everybody. like everybody,
right? They're not going to go in and take out Maduro and everything's going to be fine. It's going to be a war. I mean, they've threatened literal war and ground troops in Venezuela. And some people were just looking at the thing with the notebook the other day with John Bolton, who also, by the way, let's talk about John Bolton for a second. Full on warmonger. Again, someone else who's leading this. Like, use your brain, folks. Look at who's behind this. You don't want them doing this. Like,
and Bolton and L.A. Abrams both look like cartoon villains. It's astonishing. Like,
it really is. And so, like, this has been, I mean, this is for people who are like, I don't care what's going on in Latin America or whatever. Like, who cares what's going on in Brazil? For those of you who did follow my posts on Brazil, you will have seen me express things like Bolsonaro ran as part of his campaign promise to start a war with Venezuela to take out Maduro, right? He also talked about how he wanted to build refugee camps on the border to house Venezuelan migrants. There are a lot of Venezuelan migrants that end up in Brazil that migrate. Fine, no big deal. In the past, Brazil had fairly lenient immigration laws. So people could immigrate there and have residency fairly early on, especially in a case where if they could classify themselves, or be classified, I should say, as refugees. In which case, Brazil, prior to Bolsonaro's entering power, and prior to the guy who took over after the coup and all that, once Dilma was president still, they had a pretty flexible immigration policy. And they were giving residency for like Haitians who had left because of natural disasters and because of Venezuelan migrants who had left on the basis of, because the issue is, I think this is the other problem. A lot of times when we talk about Venezuela and food shortage, we talk about major cities like Caracas, which is the capital, but we don't talk as much about rural areas, which a lot of the migrants were fleeing from. That's a separate issue, but they were hit very hard by U.S. sanctions. So like we can't have this discussion in a vacuum. Like there's all these moving parts, and like all the moving parts are pointing to the fact that what's happening is messed up. It's unacceptable. It's absolutely a coup. Like it's absurd. Like I can't even believe sometimes that I have to have these conversations. And like the people, if you look at all of the trolls in my mentions and all the trolls on Facebook and whatever, the people who are going to the press and saying, we have to take out Maduro. I'm not talking about just general opposition. I'm talking about people who are supporting a coup. And the people who are supporting a coup are rich, white, and doing all right.
Yeah, it's not the communists in Venezuela that are to the left of the government. That's not who's supporting the coup.
Because they're saying we want change, but they're not saying we want the U.S. to orchestrate a freaking war on our ground. Like, this is not what people want.
Yes, and there's a conflation going on between people that like are ready for change and are object from Maduro from the left, even and the people that are objecting to Maduro from the right and wanting to stage a coup. Like those are it, but you can never even get to that kind of nuance unless you're talking in a circle of informed leftists, because otherwise you're basically doing imperialism's work for it.
Right.
And, so,
and there are people on like the self-proclaimed opposition, even the ones who are kind of right-leaning, they don't want a coup. Like this Guaido guy is extreme. Like I've seen examples of people have said, for example, Johanna Joanna Hausman, who's the daughter of like a wealthy, like former finance minister during the time of like full on neoliberal onslaught and harsh austerity. She has a YouTube, and she's Venezuelan, and she often does these things where she's like, this is what's happening in Venezuela. But the rest of the time she's like a comedy person, so she's not a political commentator or anything. But anyway, that aside, but she doesn't ever mention that like she's the daughter of one of the finance economics guys who was in power during like the full on austerity movement, neoliberal backed austerity movement before Chavez took over. So that's never mentioned. But she likes to say all the time, that like people don't know what's going on in Venezuela. They don't understand. The opposition is really strong. Nobody likes what's happening. Everybody's starving to death, blah, blah, blah. She paints a picture of Venezuela as if everybody's just out in the streets with pitchforks saying, take Maduro down, kill him, and let's get Trump to be our vice president after Guaido. Like, this is the image she paints,
Right.
And is in the opposition who are coming at Maduro from the right, who don't like Guaido, who don't want him to be president, who don't want a coup. So it's not, what we're seeing in the media is not reflective of, or at least I should say, when we're hearing from people who are in favor of a coup, use your brain, put things together with your brain, look at the evidence, consider, just use common sense. Like you don't have to be an expert on Venezuela. You don't have to be an expert on Latin America. You don't even have to speak Spanish. Just consider what you see and ask yourself, does this representation make sense when I put together all these facts? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? And what I'm seeing doesn't make any, or at least the support of a coup it's not logical. It doesn't make objective sense.
And from one of the things that stuck out to me in both your description and just in my general observations was something back that we talked about before, about essentially after World War II, there was a lot of studying going on and how Germany was able to make Nazis behave the way they did. And there was an idea put forth called bullet theory. And the idea was that was abandoned. But I think what we've seen both in the election or in Venezuela or a variety of different media contexts, what we see is like, no, they just decided to figure out how to shoot better and more bullets, and like, and just hope that the wall of bullets will knock down any opposing thought, like that. And so with Venezuela, we see just constant bombardment of, as Wendy, I think, very well laid out, a narrative rather than any sort of informational or sharing. We're definitely not consciousness raising with the media coverage of Venezuela. That's for sure, right? Like, and they've even managed to get like Western reporters on the streets to get people's feedback, and like that has been unduly one-sided. And I mentioned before that only since like after the first 7 days, when essentially the U.S. and West was in an ideal situation, except for some of the military contractors, that the coup works, Maduro's gone, Guaido's in charge by day 3 or something. It's like, but when that turned out not to be the way, that's the only then did you start to see, hey, wait, you mean there's supporters for Maduro in the streets? Oh, you mean there's this poll that's out there that shows that 80 some odd percent are against sanctions, and 80% are against U.S. intervention. So like this Guaido guy is representing a very small faction of the opposition to Maduro.
Yeah.
And that not only is his faction, but the opposition is being inflated and conflated. It just any sort of just looking just a little bit beyond like what the media is trying to pour into your receptacle, like just looking just slightly beyond that, and you see immediately that doesn't match. And it's like, when it doesn't match, you have to think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's an honest mistake, but these people are 6-figure, 7-figure, 8-figure salaries, professionals, there's politicians, all these, surely some of them have noticed these inconsistencies, and so they must be intentionally hiding them. And that's, I think, what concerns me the most, is that there's like, even among the ostensibly left side of American politics, this has been almost completely ignored or even cheerleaded by Dick Durbin, for example.
Yes. I think this tells us how far gone in the wrong direction people who are ostensibly left-leaning, who call themselves that, at least in the Democratic Party, that it shows, and I guess it's some other parties too, or people, groups who will remain nameless. But like even DSA, I mean, I think DSA put out a very good statement saying why anyone who's a socialist should not be supporting a coup in Venezuela. And like leaving the door open for understanding that there are going to be people with differing views in Venezuela. Like I hate it when people say things like, we have to hear from Venezuelans. It's like, yeah, but every Venezuelan doesn't have the same opinion. Like,
yeah,
it's kind
like
of
what does
weird...
that do if you do it to America? We have to listen to Americans about what they think. It's like, well,
right.
like there's a lot of different thoughts, right?
Exactly. But like having an understanding that, like, I think first and foremost, the understanding needs to be everybody has a different opinion, but the majority does not want war. And I understand that. Like, this makes sense.
It's not hard to imagine why, even if you absolutely loathed Maduro, you would not be open to the idea of the U.S. coming in and fixing it.
Right. Because we know what that means. Like, they know what that means. They've seen, I mean, they know, they literally know, because they have survived years and years and decades and centuries of external violence in their country. They know what economic austerity as dictated by the West looks like. They know what resource deprivation looks like as dictated by the West. They know what resource removal and exploration looks like. I don't think it's very obnoxious for people living in the West who are relatively safe from this type of wealth extraction to then look at a population that has suffered from imperialism for centuries and be like, hey guys, chill out. It's not that big of a deal. They just want your oil. Just give it to them and call it a day. Like, this is not how it works. And so I think that there really needs to be just like basic common sense reflection on what's going on, and then dig beyond the mainstream. You can find things in the mainstream press that show you what's happening, when they reveal themselves and they lay out what's actually going on. Because as you mentioned, Richard, it's likely a pride in that, as opposed to like doing some sort of expose. Like, they feel good about what they're doing. And this is what's also surprising right now, because I'm old enough to remember when they tried to pretend like these things were like for humanitarian reasons. And I think around the war or the invasion of Libya, that's when we really started to see them just stop even doing that. Like, with Libya, they didn't do it. With the coup in Honduras, they didn't do it. With the coup that happened, the legislative coups that happened in Paraguay and Brazil, which many of us believe that the U.S. had a direct hand in both cases, we didn't see an explanation, right? For the first time, we got like 2 seconds of explanation, and then the coup happened. And I think this is what's happening here too. Like, they gave us like the little, oh, Maduro's hurting his own people song and dance. And then after that, they just said, fuck it. We're going to just lay it all out there. We're going to say what we're doing. Let's just call it a day. And so I think now they've abandoned any pretense. And that should scare people too, that they're not even dressing it up anymore,
Yeah, it's terrifying, and yeah, just I don't. It's I struggle to grasp how people are the partisanship, the fierce partisanship, like when that melts away for a bipartisan consensus to bomb or to invade some other country, that is just like I can understand if you're 18 to 24 and the Iraq buildup isn't really in your living memory, really, like. But for anybody old enough to even vaguely kind of remember, not even just how the buildup to Iraq was, but when there was actually any sort of forensic analysis of what happened, like if you're old enough to remember that part, the parallels and with Wendy mentioned with Libya, or or what failure looks like in U.S. regime change for Syria, or that the U.S. is actively like giving weapons and bombs to Saudi Arabia to drop in other countries that are actually really starving, like soup, like not just food insecurity, but are like children and babies are laid up in beds dying from starvation, not some what looks to be some well-fed protesters on the streets complaining about Maduro. Like This is like the U.S. is sponsoring what many in the UN call the most horrific and largest humanitarian crisis in the world. So to try to balance that with what the excuse for humanitarianism in Venezuela is just unconscionable. But if you went to a politician or UN, I guarantee you they would say, well, that's some classic whataboutism. There it is.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's like, it's not, it's pointing out a contradiction in the themes in which you are trying to operate or say that you are moving through this world. You're saying you are making this in a humanitarian effort while sponsoring Saudi Arabia, who admitted at first, before like the world was like, hey, that's not cool, to intentionally bombing a bus full of children as a strategic target with a U.S. bomb and U.S. intelligence aids. Like, I mean, at first, I remember when I was more of a moderate progressive or whatever, and seeing the who's kind of become popular, the woman from Code Pink, and thinking, oh, that's a person that's kind of out there and not really helpful.
Medea Benjamin.
Yeah, and it was like, now I realize, oh, she's the only sane person in this country. It's what it feels like sometimes. It's like going up there and like screaming, we can't be going to war all the time. Like, it's like we all should be. So, like, I mean, obviously we don't all share the same kind of privileges that allow those opportunities, but like it feels like we should all be that motivated, feel that urgent about this situation and many others. And it's just like, it doesn't, I mean, we're gonna have a cop rammed down our throat for our next president. So like, I'm just at a loss.
Well, on that note, speaking of loss, we unfortunately need to end this. That kind of rounds out, that definitely rounds out part 2 of our series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Thank you all for listening thus far. If you listened to the first part, if you haven't, I would suggest go back and listen to it. And then join us for the third part of this discussion, which will be coming out in a few weeks, where we continue on with the rest of the book. And we're going to do another kind of update like we did today, based on whatever developments have happened in the world and locally by that point, because God only knows, like right now, there's so much happening in a day. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of everything and discuss it in a way that's comprehensive. But I think that your discussion, and you're kind of touching on things that we opened this episode with, and that we started to talk about when we started to discuss more on more on chapter 2, is a nice way to end it. So again, thank you all so much for listening, and be on the lookout for part 3.
Yep. I just want to say thank you to everyone, all the patrons and everybody that's sharing, and don't be a vessel, reach back out. You can find me at Road to the number 2 Revolution. I'm not huge on Twitter, so if you at me, I'll probably see it. And if it looks like you're trying to engage sincerely, I will probably engage you, so we could talk about Freire or any of the other episodes we talked about. But I don't want to be a pitcher, and I don't want anybody else to feel like a vessel. So let's learn together.
Oh, hey, speaking of learning together, one of the things that I forgot to announce in the last episode, but that I should announce now, like, surprise, surprise, Richard is actually going to be joining me as a permanent host of LeftPOC. So for those of you who've been listening for a while, you know that Richard has always been my co-host for Reading Revolution. And I think we've done, 4 or 5 episodes together, Richard, like on at least 4 or 5 works of leftist thinkers or what they were reading. But I was like, I really like having Richard as a co-host. I should just have him on all the time. So Richard is now going to be he's going to be the co-host of the LeftPOC Project. So that for those of you who maybe haven't heard a LeftPOC Project episode, I generally will interview an academic or organizer to talk about the history of leftists of color, which is what the podcast is all about and the project is all about. So I'm really excited, and I'll probably do a more formal announcement later on, but I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. You will be hearing a lot more from Richard going on in the future. And I look forward to it. And I'm really thankful that he's available and could tolerate me enough to come on as
no, it's a privilege.
Anger.
It's a privilege and an honor, and I'm thankful, and I can only hope to do what you've already done justice by when I join you.
Yeah, Richard will be the one to introduce the love as I introduce the hate and pain and anger. He'll always be the one reminding me at the end, like, Wendy, it's all about love, right? Remember Freire? Let's go back to this.
It's the smallest thing I can do to try to do anything to write the or I wasn't going to say masochistic, but the misogynistic history of this world. I can take on the burden of being the more empathetic and allow the righteous fury of oppressed women, that all the identities that Wendy embodies to be expressed through her. That's the smallest thing I can do. So it's my, again, honor and privilege to be a part of that.
Yes, and on that note, again, thank you all so much for listening and for contributing and supporting us. And we'll be back soon with part 3. Have a good one, y'all. That was the end of part 2 for our Reading Revolution series on Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Thanks so much to everyone for listening. And be sure to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, iTunes, all of the great places where you can find podcasts and more information on the show. Also, be sure to visit our Patreon, and that's patreon.com/LeftPOC, and donate to support the show, because as you know, if you've been listening, everything we post, from the podcast to the content to materials that you can read along with, to information about the people that we profile in the podcast, all of it you can find for free on the Patreon page. So your support really helps us in terms of keeping the show running. So be sure to add $1 or more each month to keep LeftPOC alive. Thanks so much again to everyone who listened and who supports, and have a good one.